Marked by an Assassin. Eternal Mate's Paranormal Romance Series, Book 8. Written by Felicity Heaton. Narrated by Eric G. Dove. Chapter 1. His leather boots were loud on the polished black stone floor that reflected warm torchlight up at him, a clunk and a scrape as he trudged along the broad arched corridor of the main entrance of the guild, heading towards the first reception room. He adjusted his grip on the black pack slung over his good shoulder and stifled another grimace as he dragged his injured left leg in line with his right and braved another step. Fiery pain bolted up his limb from a point just above his ankle, shooting through his entire body. Harbin growled under his breath, grinding his teeth together as he bore the pain and forced himself to keep moving. He could rest soon. He could sleep for days and forget his injuries and the fight that had brought him dancing too close to death. Again. But fuck, it had been a good fight. It had been worth it. The pain, the taste of blood on his tongue, the sharp crack of bones breaking beneath his fists, and the metallic tang flooding the air as his claws rendered flesh. A judder went through him, a brief flare of pleasure that racked his tired and battered body. It had been worth it, for that momentary and elusive sense of calm and belonging, of retribution and release, and the one thing he craved above all others, the one thing that fueled him, drove him to keep striding forwards, stopping him from looking back, and that he did his best to pretend didn't exist inside him like an eternal bloody flame. Penance. Penitence. Harbin pushed away from those two words. They had no place inside him. They were impossible for him to achieve, the one thing beyond his grasp, forever just out of reach. His sins were too great. Atonement was nothing more than a dream. Or maybe a nightmare. One that haunted him despite his best efforts to escape it. Voices rang along the black-walled corridor towards him, and he ignored them, not interested in the idle banter of the rest of the guild males, as they took a welcomed breather from their profession in the safety of their home. He was only interested in taking a breather himself, a long one. Maybe those days might roll into a week of sleep. He sighed at the thought. His broken body probably needed that much rest in order to recuperate swiftly, and gods knew his mind needed that amount of time to pull itself back together. Unlike some members of the guild, he didn't have the advantage of being able to accelerate his healing process. The elves were lucky sons of bitches. Although you couldn't pay Harbin enough to make him switch places with Fury. The male's eyes were verging on black now, only a sliver of violet remaining around his pupils, like a dying corona of the light in him. How long before Fury lost himself to the darkness? Hart, the chief and founder of their guild, often wore a look when he was watching Fury. One that told Harbin that the elf knew their comrade was circling the drain, and it was only a matter of time before the darkness consumed the last of him, and transformed him into something straight out of a nightmare. Harbin dragged his bad leg up and managed another step, quickly shifting his right before his fractured tibia gave out under his weight. It was times like these, when he was fresh from what had felt like more of a war than a fight, but had emerged the victor against all odds, that he couldn't help wondering just what color his eyes would be if the darkness that lived within him could show in them just as it could with the elves. Would they be darker than midnight? Was he as close to falling into the abyss as Fury was? On days like today, he felt as if he was. Every inch of him hurt now as it sank in that he was home and his mission was done, but it wasn't a physical pain. He could no longer feel the hot burn of his wounds. He could only feel the cold burn of the hollow inside of him, the scraped-out chasm where his heart used to be. Harbin idly rubbed his chest with his free hand, not feeling the pain as his left shoulder blazed, his healing skin rupturing again beneath his tight black t-shirt. Warm wetness bloomed there, soaking into the cloth before trickling down his biceps. "You look like hell," someone muttered as they passed him, heading towards the doors. Harbin ignored them and kept moving forwards, determined to reach the sanctuary of his quarters and lock himself away for a week of uninterrupted sleep. He finally stepped into the first reception room, an equally black affair that had always looked as cold and imposing to him as he supposed it was meant to be. Hart had done a good job of creating the perfect image for their guild, building a black fortress in the middle of what had once been little more than a wasteland in the free realm of hell. An entire town had sprung up around the guild, catering to those who were drawn to it, either as a client or an assassin. Harbin had visited other assassin guilds in hell, and none had the nightmarish quality of their home. He put half of their business down to pure aesthetics. People saw the guild, and it matched the image in their head of what an assassin's home should look like: cold, dark, and dangerous. And they gave it their business. Hart had been a clever son of a bitch when he had started the guild all those centuries ago. The elf certainly had a head for business, one that matched his head for killing. Hart's seen people about it now. Harbin glanced across at two young males where they lounged in the horseshoe of black velvet couches near the unlit monstrosity of a marble fireplace to his left. They were both new recruits as far as the other guild members were concerned, having only completed a few easy jobs for little pay. The blonde raked his fingers through his short hair and cracked a wide grin. "I might go for it." Harbin snorted at that at the same time as the young wolf male reclining near the blonde. "I'd pay double to see you go up against a shifter, and a cat no less. At least that Harbin guy isn't around to hear about it." That stopped Harbin in his tracks, and he frowned across at the two males, studying the brunette wolf to see if he was speaking the truth. A cat shifter? He had turned towards them before he had even contemplated moving, and was at the back of the couch where the wolf shifter lounged before he had even realized he had moved. He stared down at the pup, and the male slowly lifted golden eyes to him, his expression falling slack and lips parting as he took him in. Harbin couldn't blame the kid for looking shocked at the sight of him. He rarely interacted with the other assassins, definitely never with the rookies, and he probably looked as if he had been dragged through the darkest reaches of hell, which he had. "Cat shifter?" he said, and the male nodded dumbly. "Hart has a job requiring the elimination of a cat shifter." The wolf gathered his wits and shot him a cocky smile, one that irritated Harbin because it said what the wolf wouldn't. It asked whether he was hard of hearing or just plain crazy. He hadn't lost his mind. Not yet, anyway. He just wanted to be sure that he had heard things right, because in the close to 20 years that he had worked with Hart as an assassin, there had never been a job involving a cat shifter. The blonde kid got off the other couch and quickly crossed to his friend, hunkering down beside him and bringing his mouth close to the wolf's ear. "What the hell are you doing? That's Harbin. Hart said not to mention it around him." The blonde whispered so low he practically mouthed the words, but Harbin's sensitive ears picked them up. Harbin narrowed his silver eyes on both males, his lips compressing into a thin line, as he contemplated the only reason why Hart would want to hand out the job before Harbin could hear about it. The cat shifter was a snow leopard. He growled, flashing short fangs at the males, and shoved away from the couches, limping quickly across the black floor towards the door in the corner of the room to his left that would lead him to Hart's office. He shoved it open, the slam of it hitting the black wall on the other side echoing around the room at his back and the corridor in front of him, and snarled as he picked up his pace. His left leg trembled under the strain, but he gritted his teeth and pushed onwards, the fire burning up his blood keeping him going. Someone had put a contract on a snow leopard shifter, one of his kind, and he wanted the details. He wanted to know why Hart wouldn't give the job to him. Silvery fur rippled over his forearms before he could stop it, a brief flash of his other form brought out by his agitation. He sucked down a breath and controlled it, his skin cooling as the fur disappeared. It wasn't as if he held any allegiance to his kin anymore. He had burned that bridge 20 years ago, and there was no way in hell of reconstructing the charred remains of it. The thought that Hart believed he was incapable of dealing with a snow leopard shifter mark was insulting. He could be as methodical and removed from the situation as he always was. The rage that had consumed him in the aftermath of the event that had driven him from his pride had made sure of that. It had killed all of his softer emotions, and only a hunger for bloodshed and death remained. He passed several doors to other offices, his own included, His gaze locked on the black door at the end of the corridor ahead of him. If Hart was in an interview, the assassin in question was about to get a rude interruption and shown the door in a not-too-friendly fashion. Harbin slammed the flat of his left palm into the door, and it flew open. Hart was instantly on his feet behind the broad ebony desk directly in front of Harbin, an obsidian blade clutched in his left hand, and his skin-tight black armor sweeping over his body as his clothes evaporated. His violet eyes pinned on Harbin, and his pointed ears flared back as he bared his fangs on a hiss. The second recognition dawned in his gaze. He huffed, and the blade disappeared, leaving his hand free so he could plow his fingers through his blue-black hair, pulling the longer lengths back from his face. "It isn't wise to barge in uninvited where elves are concerned." Hart slumped into his tall-backed black leather chair and blew out his breath as he dragged his hand over his face. Harbin knew that, but he also didn't care. His blood was burning too hot, running too fast. He wanted answers, and he was going to get them. A snow leopard? He grabbed the door and slammed it shut behind him. Hart slowly lifted his violet gaze to him and raised an eyebrow. He also didn't care that his chief didn't approve of his aggressive behavior. If they came to blows, it wouldn't be the first time. Hell, it wouldn't be the 100th time. He had lost count of how many times he and Hart had fought over something. Hart was as hot-headed and hot-blooded as Harbin. Sometimes they just needed to blow off steam, and the most trivial thing became something to fight over. Nothing like a good brawl to release some tension. "I'm not giving you the job." Hart held his gaze and then slowly raked his eyes down the length of him. "Have you looked in the mirror? You're in no state to take on another mission right now." Harbin knew that, and he also didn't give a damn. A hot twinge rocketed up his left leg from his fractured tibia, as if his body was trying to emphasize Hart's point. Son of a bitch. He gritted his teeth and schooled his features, trying to hide the pain from Hart. The elf merely sighed again. "You need to rest and recuperate. Sit this one out." Hart straightened in his chair and began shifting papers around on his desk, a clear "you can leave now" that Harbin chose to ignore. This conversation wasn't done. It didn't matter that he had just rolled back into the guild after tracking and eliminating multiple targets in a mission that had been demanding to say the least. There wasn't another assassin in the guild who had the patience or balls to tackle such a job, one where they had to take out an entire party of demon mercenaries without alerting the others to the deaths of their comrades. He had spent 3 weeks orchestrating it, slowly intervening to adjust the movements of each member of the group to his favor, so he could separate them and deal with them individually but swiftly. None in the guild had the strength to take down 5 demons of the 4th realm in one battle. Attempting to take them down one by one had been dangerous enough, and difficult to say the very least. If they had grouped together, they would have easily overpowered him and sent him back to the guild in a box with their regards. "You know you need your best tracker on this." Harbin dropped his pack on the floor and eased down into the chair opposite Hart, making it clear he wasn't going to just leave quietly and forget this mission as his boss wanted. Hart's violet eyes remained locked on what had to be a particularly interesting paper based on how much attention he was giving it. "You don't have an assassin here who can track like I can, and I know snow leopards. I'll get the scent of the mark long before one of the others could find them without using their nose." "I don't want you on this job. You have your orders, Harbin. Rest and recuperate." Hart deigned him with a quick glance, his sharp gaze pinning Harbin with a look that warned him to let it go. It wasn't going to happen. "I'm taking this job." Harbin settled both hands behind his head, masking his grimace as his left shoulder blazed in protest, and cupped his neck as he stared at Hart. "And if you try to give it to someone else, I'll hear about it, and I'll track them down and kill them." Hart's black eyebrows pinched in a frown. Harbin knew he was pushing his luck by threatening other members of the guild, but he needed to be back out there. He needed it. Why? He hadn't crossed paths with a snow leopard in a long time. He had avoided them as best he could, spending most of his time in hell, and sticking to cities when he had to visit the mortal realm. He even avoided fey towns because they often had a small population of shifters residing in them. Why was he so eager to place himself on a collision course with one now? Hart's questioning look asked him the same thing, and he didn't have an answer for the elf. It was just a need that burned inside him, a quiet voice that urged him to take the mission and discover why a snow leopard, one from a normally peaceful species, was the target. That same quiet voice supplied that it was because he feared. Harbin snorted at that. He feared nothing, no one, not anymore. It was curiosity driving him, plain and simple. He was curious to see what a snow leopard had done to make themselves the target of an assassination. "Fine," Hart said, jolting Harbin back to the room. Before he could open his mouth to speak or move a muscle to leave the chair, Hart's expression turned flat and cold, silencing him and freezing him to the spot. "You get the job on the basis that it will be done as a team." Harbin growled. "I don't need a fucking babysitter." Hart flashed fangs at him. "You have one or you don't get the job. Fury is due to return. You'll track the mark and we'll meet you in 5 days, tracking you via your implant." Harbin stared across the black desk at the elf male. He had been on the verge of refusing to work with Fury, a psychotic son of a bitch on the best of days, when Hart had mentioned the royal we. Hart was taking the job with him. The bastard was coddling him. He wanted to growl again at that, but held it locked inside where his animal form shifted violently in response to his aggravation, wanting to tear into the male opposite him for daring to doubt him. He drew in a deep breath to settle himself and blew it out slowly, finding a sliver of calm that he could cling to, and that allowed him to see the reason for Hart's coddling in his purple eyes. He was concerned and reluctant, and Harbin could understand that. It had nothing to do with his current condition. Hart knew his history. The elf had crossed paths with him at the darkest point in his life, and Harbin owed him more than he had ever been able to put into words to tell him. Hart had been the one to pick him up, give him a new place to call home and a new purpose. He had given him a new life when his old one had crumbled around him. Harbin had spent 2 decades as an assassin, but he had also spent 2 decades devoted to tracking down and killing the people who had attacked his pride. Archangel. During those 20 years, he had slowly shifted from spending most of his time hunting Archangel members to spending most of his time carrying out assassination contracts on other targets. Hart had been the one to guide him on that path, helping him track Archangel at first, and then helping him let go of his past as best he could and move forward with his life. Now, Harbin no longer lived to make Archangel pay. He lived to kill, and he didn't care who was a victim of his blades. He only cared about feeding his hunger. He craved the emotionless state that came before a kill. He had embraced the cold and methodical part of himself that allowed him to do his job without feeling a damned thing, without remembering the horrors of his past and that it was all his fault. Harbin closed his eyes and ground his teeth, shunning the memories that tried to surface by focusing on his next mission. Forever looking forwards and never looking back at the ghosts that chased on his heels, the specters of a time he didn't want to remember. All that mattered was chasing the high of feeling nothing, feeding the beast inside him. There was always a next mission, another mark to put to the blade. He slowly opened his silver eyes and fixed them on Hart, the cold filling him as he shut down all of his feelings in preparation for the mission ahead. The snow leopard was a mark and nothing more. He would track them as Hart requested, using his knowledge of his kind to his advantage. And then he would kill them. Chapter 2. Aya's back hit the wall with enough force to shake snow from the roof. It fell in a waterfall behind the male in front of her, a brief shield that gave them a flash of privacy as his mouth descended on hers. She shuddered from the fumbling clash of their lips and his taste as it flooded her senses, drawing all of her focus to him and bringing every nerve to life within her. She moaned into his mouth as he found his stride, and his kiss became passionate and demanding, possessive. Her body heated, fire sweeping through her as she desperately tangled her fingers in his hair and clung to him, riding the storm of the new feelings and sensations as they bombarded her. He groaned, the sound of a sweet hit of pleasure that her body responded to against her will, arching into his. A solid wall of muscle and power greeted her, pressed against her and made her only quake for more. His hands clamped down on her, one grasping her right hip and the other burrowing beneath her fall of silvery hair, to grip the nape of her neck, holding her in place against him. She shuddered again, a fierce hot shiver that he responded to by angling his head and deepening the kiss, leaving no part of her untouched. The voice of reason surfaced at the back of her mind, telling her that she shouldn't be doing this, but she shoved it aside, ignoring it as she began to kiss him back, attempting to match his fervent passion. She bravely met his tongue with hers and fought back, earning a husky growl as her reward. His grip on her tightened, and she flinched as his fingertips pressed in with bruising force. Desire instantly turned to panic. The heat of passion became a cold prickling down her spine. Her chest tightened, lungs seizing as she fought his hold, but he refused to let her go. No. Screams rose around her, the terrified shrieks of young and old alike, and she shoved at the male's chest, battering him and trying to break free of his hold. The man said something and only gripped her harder, his voice no longer matching the deep one that had teased her ears just moments before. She opened her eyes and stared into his cold, dark eyes, seeing a different male before her, a mortal male. Fear crashed over her as the scent of blood assaulted her, and the white world she loved so dearly was painted red beyond him. No. Aya twisted her hands free and shoved hard at his chest, sending him stumbling backwards and slipping on the icy ground. She broke right, skidding herself as her boots fought for purchase. Ahead of her, 2 more men in black fatigues dragged an unconscious male member of her pride across the snowy square in the center of her village. A woman with blonde hair spilling from underneath her black skull cap followed them. Her green eyes swung towards Aya and narrowed. She said something and pointed towards her. Aya's heart leaped into her throat as she heard the man behind her getting to his feet, and dodged right again, heading between the 2 small wooden-framed buildings, clutching the pale gray stone bases that supported the black beams and plaster walls, keeping the delicate structure off the permanent snow for support as she did her best to run. The scent of blood grew stronger, and hot tears spilled down her cheeks as she ran towards the source of the smell. She had to help them. A male twisted into her path when she reached the wider street at the end of the alley, his agonized wail cutting short as he fell to the snow. He landed face down in the white powder, and she skidded to a halt beside him. "We have to move." She grabbed his arm and tried to pull him up, determined to help him flee the battle that had erupted in their peaceful home. Her eyes darted around, heart pounding as she scoured her mountain village for more mortals, fearing they would catch her and the male if they didn't move quickly. They had to escape. Her gaze shot right, towards the edge of the village and a path that would take them up the dangerous rocky peaks in the distance there. If she could gather as many of her kin as she could and guide them there, they could shift and escape the mortals. "Come on!" She tugged at the male. He didn't respond, so she maneuvered him onto his back so she could grasp him by his arms and drag him to safety. Her blood chilled, and she snatched her hands back. Dull, lifeless eyes stared up at her, his pale skin splashed with crimson that soaked the ground where he had been laying. Aya stared back at him, her skin prickling and her mind going blank. She slowly shook her head, refusing to believe what she was seeing. It wasn't possible. She lifted her chin and looked in the opposite direction to the mountain path, her gaze sweeping over the madness unfolding there, struggling to make sense of what was happening. Black shadows moved everywhere, attacking her kin, killing her kin. Aya's lips flattened and then peeled back off her short fangs, all thoughts of running leaving her as she took in the pandemonium that had erupted in her peaceful home. She growled and shoved off, leaping over the dead male and heading for the second square ahead of her, where several females were attempting to fend off another group of shadowy figures. She tore at her clothes, stripping off the layers as she sprinted hard. One of the females went down as she attempted to protect a young boy. Aya snarled, and her claws grew at the same time as her fangs. She roared as she reached the end of the alley between the small houses and leaped high into the air. Pain shot through her bones as they transformed, and silvery thick furs swept over her body. She came free of her clothes at the apex of her jump and growled through her teeth as she began to descend, heading straight for two males. The click and slide of metal on metal stole her focus, and she snapped her head up, her eyes settling on the third man in the clearing. He raised his rifle and took aim. Fired. Aya shot up in bed, her rapid breathing and the frantic beat of her heart the only sound in the dark room. Sweat trickled down her spine and between her bare breasts as she fought for air. Her wide eyes locked across the room on the wooden chest of drawers and wardrobe that lined the pale blue wall. A cool breeze caressed her left side, washing in from the small gap at the bottom of the sash window there, carrying the calming scent of the night. She breathed deep of it, struggling to settle her pounding pulse and her emotions. Her fingers tightened in the cream covers pooled in her lap, twisting them into her grip as everything crashed over her. 1,000 memories she would rather not possess. One she had buried deep and finally forgotten as she moved on with her life. Until that male had walked into the club last night. The return of her nightmares was his fault. She hadn't seen another snow leopard in over a decade, and she had never wanted to see one again. She had been happy living without the reminder of what she was, because now it was only a cold and dark reminder of what had happened to her. It took her back to that day when her life had been turned into a waking nightmare. Everyone she had loved stripped from her as she had fought to save them all. Aya bent forwards and plowed her fingers through her damp black hair, pulling the jaw-length strands back. She clutched the sides of her head and tried to focus on her breathing as memories surged to the surface again. Her throat closed and her heart thundered against her ribs, a sickening rhythm that echoed in her ears, together with distant screams and pleas for mercy. She shook her head in an attempt to dislodge those memories and growled. She wanted to forget again. She needed to immerse herself in the tangled fey and mortal world, losing herself in it, and surrounding herself with people, or she would only sink deeper into her memories, her instincts forcing her to seek out the familiar faces of her past so she would no longer feel alone. She needed to escape that past, and that meant returning to the club. It had become her sanctuary over the past few years, a place she returned to nightly to talk with the people she knew there, fulfilling the deep need to be part of a group that had been formed in her decades at the bustling Pride village where she had grown up. Now she sought crowds whenever she woke, escaping the emptiness of her apartment, hurling herself into the fray and dancing or drinking the night away. It was a risk because she knew the male might be there too. A flash of silver shot across the darkness of her closed eyes. It drifted back and split, forming into two piercing orbs and a messy tuft atop them. The male. She had felt the intensity of his gaze the moment he had entered. It had sent an electric shiver through her, a bolt of awareness that had shattered everything around her, leaving only him behind. She shivered again beneath the covers, her heart beating harder for a different reason, as heat swept through her as it had last night when his gaze had drifted over her, taking her in from head to toe. He shimmered into being in her mind, and she snapped her eyes open, breaking the illusion. Aya shoved the covers off her bare legs, shifted them over the right edge of the double mattress, and rose from the bed. She stretched, moaning as she arched her back. There was nothing quite as enjoyable as a good stretch when she woke up. She lowered her arms and checked the clock on her bedside table. The numbers cast a green hue across her small bedroom, providing the only light. It was already growing late. She had managed to sleep through the day before her nightmare had begun. Hopefully tomorrow she could do the same again without the nightmare. She padded across the narrow span of wooden floor to the bathroom opposite her and flicked on the light, flinching as the white tiles reflected the brightness and seemingly magnified it, hurting her sensitive eyes. Aya gave them a moment to adjust before opening them again. Her reflection in the mirror above the gray vanity greeted her. or possibly mocked. She looked awful. Her silver-gold eyes were bloodshot, last night's makeup smeared like black ash all around them, emphasizing how tired they looked. She tugged her fingers through her messy black hair, trying to smooth the wild short strands that stuck out in all directions at jaw level. Silver threaded her hair, turning her stomach. She would need to dye it again soon. She hadn't been able to face herself with her natural hair color since starting her new life. It was a reminder of her past, another thorn that only tore at her and left her bleeding inside. She had loved her silver hair once, back when life had been carefree and simple, and she had lived at the Pride Village, back when she'd had a pride. She turned her cheek to the gaunt female in the mirror and headed towards the double shower cubicle that took up the entire right side of the room. A shower would help clear her head and set her back on track. Aya slid the door open and stepped into the cubicle. The water was cold as she lifted the lever to start the flow, but soon warmed to her preferred temperature. She turned beneath the spray, closed her eyes and sighed as the hot water pounded down her back. The effect was immediate, easing her muscles and washing away her bad memories. She focused on showering, using the routine to empty her mind. Once she had rinsed the conditioner out of her hair, she switched off the water, slid the door open again, and grabbed a towel from the rack. Her mind drifted as she dried off, thoughts of who would be at the club tonight keeping her occupied. She shut out any about the mail and scrubbed the towel across her hair. Satisfied that she wouldn't leave a trail of water across the pale floor tiles, she stepped out of the shower and moved to the next step of her routine. When her hair was tamed, the fine black strands styled to lay flat on top, but flick outwards and upwards at the ends in a cute way. She applied her standard black makeup around her eyes, a dash of lip gloss, and a quick spray of perfume. Aya padded out into the bedroom, grabbed her white strapless bra from the floor where she had tossed it last night before falling into bed, and put it on. She followed it with a matching pair of knickers from her chest of drawers at the foot of the bed, and then sidestepped to her wardrobe and pulled the doors open. Jeans. She grabbed a pair of black ones from the pile at the bottom of the wardrobe and tugged them on. They were tighter than she remembered. She growled as she wriggled into them, muttering beneath her breath about cutting back on the sweet treats whenever she visited a coffee shop or hit the grocery store. She had always been average, not a woman blessed with a stick-thin figure, and never one to want to look that way either. But she was holding a little more winter padding than normal. Back at the Pride, she had gotten away with indulging in her love of food, needing the fuel to keep her warm. Old habits died the hardest. She never had managed to shake her constant craving for food, even in the warmer weather of London. Her silvery gaze roamed over the hangers filled with a range of camisoles, t-shirts, and long-sleeved tops. The weather was cooler now, but she found herself picking a silver halter top with a plunging neckline, one she hadn't worn in months. It had nothing to do with the mail. She just wanted to feel good about herself tonight, and dressing to impress would certainly boost her mood. She wasn't planning to catch his eye if he was there again tonight. Definitely wasn't interested in sending any signals to him. She planned to avoid him and catch the eye of another male. Any other male. Hell, maybe she would flirt with a few of them. The attention from them would definitely make her feel fabulous. She might even do more than flirt. It had been a long time since she had been with a male, and she needed a little physical contact, a little craziness to blow off some steam. It might even change her outlook for the better, making her forget her worries and see some good in the world again. Aya pulled the silver top on, tugging the triangular cups beneath her breasts and smoothing the material over her stomach. It barely reached the belt of her jeans, and it would flash her belly if she raised her arms above her head, but she didn't care. Tonight was about feeling good and forgetting, not about worrying what others made of her figure. Their opinion didn't matter. She was happy as she was, and she refused to change herself to suit anyone's tastes. This was her life, and she was going to live it. She blew out her breath, closed the wardrobe doors, and gave herself a quick once-over in the mirror on the left door. She brushed her fingers through her hair, fixed a smile on her face to shove her nerves away, and turned away from her reflection. She found her favorite black ankle boots with their short square heels perfect for adding a little height, but not making her ache as she danced, or compromising her balance, and put them on. There, ready to face the world. Aya walked into the small living room adjoining her bedroom and grabbed her keys and small purse off the sideboard to her left near the main door. She resisted the temptation to check her reflection again in the oval mirror above the sideboard, heading straight to the door instead. She made fast work of the locks, opened it, and stepped out into the brightly lit cream corridor. The locks clicked back into place as she closed the door, and she pocketed her keys and hurried along the corridor towards the stairs that would take her down to the main entrance hall several floors below. Her heels clicked on the steps, punctuating the silence, and the pace of them picked up as she crossed the entrance hall. The night air was even cooler now as she pushed the glass double doors open, and she breathed deep of it. The scents hit her hard, a myriad of smells that had her instincts sharpening as they awakened a desire to identify each one and map her neighborhood. The nearby restaurants provided the strongest range of smells, tempting her into taking a detour. She resisted the call of food and hailed a taxi instead. The black cab slowed and pulled over, and she made her way between two parked cars to reach it. The journey to the club passed in silence, her gaze fixed on the outside world as it whizzed by in a blur of colored lights and black shadows, her animal side shifting restlessly beneath her skin. She wanted to be out in the darkness, prowling the parks in her snow leopard form, and marking everything with her scent, so all shifters in the area would know this was her patch. How long had it been since she had shifted? Too long. Years at best. She could put it off for as long as she could, but the need to shift steadily built inside her, growing stronger with each day that passed, until it grew impossible to ignore, even when she wanted to avoid the reminder of what she was. The male had brought the need from a growl to a deafening roar in her blood. Now she itched with a hunger to let her snow leopard side out, her fingers twisting the silver material of her halter top into her palms as she fought that urge. Maybe when she got back tomorrow morning, she would look into booking a short break up north. Over the years she had been away from the mountains of her homeland, the rugged valleys of Scotland had become her favorite place to get lost in the wilderness and spend days roaming in her animal form. The cab ground to a halt, jerking her away from a fantasy about drifting through the heather with only nature for company and basking on the rocks. The bright neon sign of Switch blazed off to her right, the bouncer outside it nodding as he noticed her. He stepped away from the open doors of the backstreet nightclub, and she smiled as he pulled the cab door open for her. Aya slipped the driver his money, plus a generous tip, and stepped out of the car. "Rocky," she said as the big shaven-headed bouncer grinned down at her before giving the car door a gentle push. It slammed shut with enough force to rock the cab. Bear shifters didn't know their own strength, and Rocky was no exception. Aya had taken to calling him Rocky a few years ago when she had started frequenting the club and they had spent a quiet night talking. He came from a small pride of bear shifters in Canada, near the mountains she had named him for. His circumstances were similar to hers, so she understood why he had wanted to keep his name to himself, using the boring alias of Tom instead. He had taken to the name she had given him, and now everyone called him Rocky. Aya glanced toward the dark entrance of the club, her heart beating a little quicker, and her palms sweating as she struggled to keep her breathing even and convince herself to go inside. Rocky clapped a meaty hand down on her bare shoulder. "He ain't here." Relief swept through her, and she tried to hide it from Rocky, but realized she had failed when his grin stretched wider, tugging at a vicious scar that ran across his lips on the right side and down to his square jaw. He was as rugged as the mountains he hailed from, too, but handsome nonetheless, especially when he wasn't playing his role of bouncer, scowling at customers and keeping watch over the club he called home. His rich brown eyes sparkled with mischief. Aya held her hand up to silence him before he could talk about the male shifter she wanted to avoid. "Here's hoping he buggers off to Underworld," she muttered, and amusement joined the mischief in Rocky's eyes. They had bonded over a dislike of that nightclub, too, And it wasn't only because it was a competitor for Switch, the club she favored and he worked for. It was because that club employed two males from a species both of them wanted to keep their distance from, a bear and a snow leopard shifter. Distant sirens made her lift her head and peer along the dark street in their direction. It wasn't the safest neighborhood in London, but that didn't bother her. Life had taught her how to handle herself, how to fight and survive, and she wasn't afraid to deal with anyone who got too familiar with her when she didn't want their attention. She wasn't afraid to kill someone, the male snow leopard included. He was stronger than her, but that wouldn't stop her from making him familiar with her claws if he tried anything. Rocky trudged across the narrow strip of pavement to the door of the club and resumed his position beside it, pressing his back against the red brick wall and folding his arms across his broad chest. His muscles bulged beneath his tight black t-shirt, and all humor fled from his face, the hardened expression he wore turning him into a daunting male with a dangerous edge. Anyone roaming the street looking for a fight would think twice before bothering him or trying to gain entrance to the club. Aya hoped that went for the male snow leopard, too. She flicked a glance at Rocky, toyed with the idea of asking him to stop the male from entering the club if he did show up, and then walked into the dark entrance without saying a word. This was her turf, and she wasn't going to let anyone see her scared when she was on it. If the male showed up, she would deal with him. She wanted him to walk right through the doors at her back. She wanted him to dare to set foot in her territory again, because she wasn't the sort of female who would let a male walk all over her. Not anymore. Chapter 3. Aya jerked her chin up, brushed her short black hair back from her face, and strolled into the club with just enough sway in her hips to have a few of the hungrier males in the expansive room looking her way. Colorful lights flashed in time with the pounding tempo of the rock music, a visible beat that spoke to her animal side, and had her prowling through the half-filled club, heading towards the bar at the far end. The hazy glass panel at the front of it changed colors, fading through green, yellow, red, and blue. Purple lights above the bar washed over the white metal top and the people lining it, telling her that Amanda was in charge tonight. The color changed depending on who was the boss behind the bar. Her luck was in. Amanda made the best cocktails. Things were already looking up. She skirted the edge of the dance floor, her eyes raking over every male on it, assessing them in turn, seeking out her first partner. Some of them glanced her way, taking their eyes off their females and giving her their attention instead. She smiled at them all, a range of shifters and fae, and some mortals mixed in. Any one of them would do. She turned back towards the bar, and a group of mortal males broke apart to allow her passage, creating a clear run between her and the bar. A male there caught her eye. A vampire. It wasn't often she saw their kind around, but he was unmistakable as he lounged casually on a stool, his right arm propped up on the bar beside him. His deep crimson gaze locked on her, sending a thrill coursing through her blood, and she added a little extra sway to her hips and slowed her pace, capturing and holding his focus on her. He was perfect. It was little wonder many of the single females in the club were watching him closely. With neatly styled dark hair, shorn close around the sides but left wild on top, and wicked full lips set in a classically handsome face with a strong jaw, straight nose, and sculpted cheekbones, he was the image of perfection, the embodiment of masculinity. The black shirt he wore was slightly open at the collar, revealing defined muscles that hinted at a body to match the perfection of his face. His sensual lips tilted in a ghost of a smile. He thought he had found a victim, a walking blood bag who would feed him, and she wasn't about to tell him how wrong he was about that. Biting was off the agenda. She never allowed fangs near her flesh. The way his gaze dipped, roaming down the line of her throat, and his lips curved further, told her he had noticed that, and the way his eyes brightened, burning faintly in the low light, warned he liked it. She was playing with fire, but she didn't care. Not tonight. Tonight was about forgetting, and he was the perfect male to erase the past from her mind. Aya halted at the bar and flagged the only female member of staff, Amanda. The brunette smiled, nodded, and went to work on her drink, mixing her the same potent cocktail she always requested. The vampire leaned closer, inhaled slowly, and growled low in his throat. A shiver bolted through Aya, a flash fire following in its wake, and she slowly slid her gaze towards him. His eyes met and locked with hers, and her breathing came quicker. Vampires were alluring, but this male was something else, something more. Crimson eyes held hers, and the sensation of danger she had felt when approaching him increased. But rather than triggering a need to escape his presence, it drew her to him instead. Tonight she was in the mood for danger and seduction, and this male would give that to her. "It's on me," the male said as the bartender dropped her drink off. Amanda nodded and moved away to the till. The vampire pressed 2 fingers against the base of the martini glass and pushed it across the white bar top to Aya, his charming smile holding. "You look like you need this," he murmured, and her sensitive hearing picked up his words over the loud thumping music. Aya held his gaze as she took the drink, swallowed it down in one go, and set the glass back down on the bar. "I need more than this," she whispered and inched closer to him, so her hip brushed his thigh. His gaze lowered to where they touched, narrowed, and then darted back up to hers. He growled, flashing short fangs, grabbed her right wrist, and spun her towards him. Hunger filled his eyes, need that she felt echoing inside her. She had been alone too long, too. She needed to lose herself in someone, had to purge the bad memories and fill her head with something to keep them at bay. That something was him. The male moved in a blur, and she gasped when she was suddenly on the busy dance floor, his hands on her hips and his body swaying against hers in an intoxicating rhythm. It took her a moment to catch up, but the second she did, she threw her arms around his neck and ground against him, rubbing up his thigh as he pressed it between her legs. Gods, she needed this. Her heart pounded, the frantic beat drowning out the music, as she lost herself in the sway of his body against hers and the rich depths of his eyes. Her instincts whispered again, warning she was playing with fire, and this time she might get burned. Screw it. She had already been burned. No one could burn her worse than he had, not even a vampire. She threw herself into dancing with him, working up a sweat and burning off some energy as they writhed against each other to the beat of the music. She lost track of time as the songs faded from one to another and then another. He turned with her and she frowned briefly as a scar around his neck caught the sudden flash of white light that cascaded over him. It was thin, would be unnoticeable at a distance, but this close to him she could see it, and she couldn't help wondering how he had come to have it, and how he had survived the wound. The silvery line stretched from below his left ear, around the front of his throat, over his Adam's apple where it was thicker and more pronounced, to below his right ear. It looked as if someone had attempted to cut his head clean off, and should have succeeded, but somehow he had escaped with his life. She wanted to know how, but the way he was staring down at her when she finally drew her gaze away from the scar warned her to hold her tongue. A couple of males bumped against them on the busy dance floor, and the vampire turned crimson eyes on them and curled his lip, flashing a hint of fang that had them backing into the crowd. He drew her closer, his scent surrounding her and stealing her focus away from the world, narrowing it down to him. She let it overwhelm her, let her guard down, and gave herself over to the moment. "What's your name?" she hollered over the music. The man smiled, charming to the last, his eyes glittering dangerously with it. "Night." "Aya," she said without missing a beat, sensing that he was waiting for her to comment on his name. If it was his real one, his parents had a bad sense of humor, but she couldn't deny that it suited him. He was as seductive, beautiful, and dangerous as the night. A shiver prickled down her spine, setting her on edge and shattering the hold the vampire had over her. Her silver-gold gaze drifted beyond him, towards the entrance, and her breath lodged in her throat. The snow-leopard male. Aya fixed her eyes back on Night, trying to give him all of her attention again as they moved with each other, their bodies locked tight together. Her focus slipped, her eyes wanting to roam back to the other male, drawn to him even when she didn't want them to be. She watched him in the corner of her vision as she looked up at the vampire. The silver-haired male limped as he walked, favoring his right leg, but it didn't detract from the lethal edge to his gait as he prowled into the club. He was dangerous. Every instinct she possessed fired that warning across her mind, making it impossible to ignore. He was more dangerous than the vampire grinding against her, pulling her closer to him, dipping his head to course his lips over her exposed shoulder. The snow leopard's silver eyes narrowed and she shut hers, blocking him out as she twined her fingers in Night's dark hair. Gods! Her breath left her in a rush as she felt the snow leopard's eyes fix on her, the intensity of his gaze burning through her, drawing her into opening hers to look at him again. She resisted, tried to focus on the male dancing with her, using all of her will to pretend she couldn't feel the snow leopard's gaze drifting down her body as he passed. It lingered on her hips, on the point where the vampire clutched her, his fingers possessively digging into her black jeans as he lifted his head from her shoulder and growled. A threat if ever she had heard one. She held her breath, part of her expecting the snow leopard to respond. He moved on, silent and stealthy, the epitome of a predator. He wouldn't rise to the threat of a lesser male. He would bide his time, study his opponent, and only make his move once he had discovered a weakness he could exploit, and only if he decided he wanted her. It had been so long since she had been around her own kind that she had forgotten how mature males behaved. The air left her lungs in a whoosh again, her heart thundering against her breast as the vampire spun her in his arms and pulled her back against his front, grinding against her bottom and leaving her face to face with the snow leopard male. Double gods. It hit her hard as she stared across the open expanse of room between her and him where he casually took a seat at the bar directly in front of her. She had chosen the vampire because he was the opposite of this male. A snow leopard with an unruly shock of silver hair and pure silver eyes set in a ruggedly handsome face that sported numerous pale scars that immediately had her wondering what sort of life he had led. What sort of hell had he survived? It couldn't be any worse than what she had been through. He stared straight at her, stealing all of her focus away from the vampire, and this time she couldn't convince herself to look away. The coldness in his eyes entranced her, a snowy abyss that reminded her of her pride's village high in the mountains, far away from the mortal world. Stark, dangerous, liable to kill you if you set a foot wrong. Whatever had happened to this male, it had turned him feral, had made him into a killer rather than a male from a species known for their calmness and desire to avoid conflict. He looked as if he courted danger, sought out conflict, and enjoyed bathing his hands in blood. His black t-shirt stretched over a firm body, his arms sporting more scars than she could count, and tight black jeans hugged his long, lean legs. The fingers of his right hand flexed constantly, a restless movement she had seen many males do when they were on edge. Did he want to fight? He was injured, but that didn't make him weak. He looked like the sort of male that would only be more dangerous when wounded. His eyes remained icy as he shifted in his seat, and she would have missed the twist of his lips that betrayed him if she hadn't been studying him so closely. More than his leg was injured. The way he held his left arm in his lap told her that it was wounded too. Her eyes dropped to his feet and narrowed as she spotted the black thick material encasing his left foot, at odds with the leather army boot he wore on his right. A cast. Had he broken his leg? The vampire skimmed his hands forward, brushing the apex of her thighs, and providing a startling reminder that she wasn't alone. She gasped and tried to evade his wandering hands, but only ended up pressing harder against his front, rubbing his groin with her backside. He groaned against her shoulder and bit lightly with blunt teeth. The snow leopard's eyes burned brighter, a flare of silver shining around his narrowing pupils, as if the sight of the vampire touching her had infuriated him. Aya didn't belong to him. She could do as she damn well pleased. She turned in Knight's arms, giving him the whole of her attention again, as she resumed dancing. He pulled her closer, grinning at her as she rubbed against him. She was pushing her luck. It wasn't the vampire she feared either. Her primal instincts warned that the snow leopard male was losing his temper, and she was heading into dangerous territory. Aya didn't want to get the vampire killed, and she refused to drag innocents into what would amount to a bloodbath if the snow leopard lost his temper in the busy club. She glanced at the huge digital clock mounted on the black wall above the corridor to the exit. It was time she made her excuses and left. "I need a drink," she hollered above the music as it began to fade and broke free of Knight's clutches. "I'll be right back." She heard a faint rumble of disapproval, but he didn't try to stop her as she made a beeline for the bar, heading towards the end furthest from the snow leopard male. She could slip out the back through the door in the corner there, using her normal escape route she took whenever things got a little too hot and heavy for her liking. The snow leopard tracked her as she made her way through the crowd, his gaze never leaving her. It was going to be difficult to get away without him noticing. What if he came after her? Her pulse accelerated, cold sweat prickling down her spine at the thought of him catching her alone outside. Maybe it was better she slipped out the main exit. Rocky would take care of her, ensuring the male kept his distance. A snow leopard was no match for a bear shifter. Aya turned her back to the bar, her eyes swinging past the male towards the main exit at the opposite end of the club. She pushed away from the bar. Panicked shouts filled the air, a rush of people coming at her, confusing her senses as they sharpened, and her instincts screamed at her to take the back exit and run. Several males bumped her as they raced in that direction, and her eyes widened as she caught sight of the other end of the club. People dressed in black combat gear surged into the busy room, driving the patrons in a wave towards her. "Police!" someone shouted. "Raid!" another yelled as they shoved their way through the throng, heading towards her in an attempt to flee. Aya shook her head as she stared at the large group of males splitting apart and grabbing any shifter or fae they came across. They weren't the police. They were Archangel hunters. Chapter 4. The mark was a female. Harbin hadn't believed his eyes when he had set them on her in the grotty club in the suburbs of London. He had tracked her without ever realizing what she was. None of his fae contacts had mentioned the gender of the snow leopard he had been asking questions about, but then he hadn't bothered to ask them about the sex of his mark either. He had presumed it would be a male. Sure, he had tracked and assassinated female marks in the past, but never a shifter. Females of the cat shifter species generally stayed within the boundaries of their pride homes, or at least within the limit of the law, keeping their heads down and tails out of trouble. What had she done to make someone take out a contract on her? He had been curious to know the answer to that question when he had discovered a snow leopard had a price on their head, but now he burned with a need to know. It played on his mind, constantly bouncing around in his skull and keeping him distracted. What could she have done? Normally his marks were mercenaries, murderers, or worse, but she didn't seem to fit any of those roles. Nothing about her said she was dangerous, and nothing he had gleaned from his contacts had pointed towards her being a killer, or worthy of the bounty someone had placed on her. Harbin stared across the room at the female in question, watching the way the vampire at her back pawed at her as they danced. The sight of the vile bastard's hands all over her caused his animal side to prowl just beneath his skin, restless with a need to separate them and then separate the vampire's head from his body. He despised their kind. Leeches, all of them. He sighed as he caught his train of thought and derailed it. Maybe hardened fury had rubbed off on him in the years they had been together. Elves hated vampires with a passion, a dislike that ran both ways, born of the fact that vampires were distantly related to the elves. They were a wretched shadow of the elves, born from the corrupted ones left behind in this mortal realm millennia ago. The vampires had none of their forefathers' key abilities, though, and the elves believed that was the reason they despised them so much. Harbin could understand that. He would be pissed if he discovered his kind were an offshoot from one that could teleport, use telekinesis, didn't go crispy in sunlight, and didn't have to drink blood to survive. The vampire slid his hands lower, startling the female, and a growl rumbled up Harbin's throat. rising from the pit of his belly as it churned with a need to sink his claws into the mail. Her wide eyes held Harbin immobile, though, pinned to his stool, his mind filled with a constant cycle of questions, some of which bothered him, because for the first time in a long time, he was wondering what the hell he was doing with his life. That niggling voice had started up the second he had set eyes on the female last night. A barrage of images had hit him, a horrifying replay of entering his Pride village to find his mother and sister laying in a pool of blood on the crisp white snow. A rapid succession of memories had followed it, a rush of dark moments, all fragmented and blended together into a mind-numbing stream of pain, terror, and bloodshed. A twisted version of the events that had happened as he had tracked down the bastards who had attacked his pride. Archangel. He ground his teeth, his emerging fangs cutting into his gums, flooding his mouth with the bitter taste of blood. It had all been his fault, the deaths of his beloved mother and sister, the deaths of so many of his kin. Those deaths weighed his soul down, and nothing he did lightened the load he carried. It was his to bear, and he would carry the face of every victim with him until his dying day. He would recount them all whenever he crushed another Archangel member under his boot, giving them the same bloody end they had bestowed upon his beautiful kin. Harbin closed his eyes and swallowed hard, fighting the pain that rose within him, pouring like acid into the hollow in his chest. He deserved the pain. He deserved the exile his father, the Alpha of the Pride, had given him as his sentence. He deserved to suffer until Archangel no longer existed. He deserved it because he had been the one to lead Archangel to his pride. He could kill every member of Archangel all across the world, but it wouldn't make a difference, and he knew it. It wouldn't bring his family back, or the other snow leopards who had lost their lives because of him. Harbin opened his eyes and fixed them on the female, catching her as she broke free of the vampire and started across the busy room. What was he doing? Had it really come down to this? Tracking and killing one of a breed he had spent the past 2 decades trying to avenge in his own way? His stomach turned, sickness brewing there as his mind supplied that he was no better than Archangel if he killed her. He had hated seeing his kin attacked and murdered, had hunted and killed all but one of the Archangel members responsible, to stop them from getting their hands on any more of his species. Now he was going to hunt one and kill it? He was going to kill her? Harbin stared at her, cold to the bone and numbed as the world around him dropped away. How far had he fallen? When had he lost sight of his true mission, the task of avenging his people? That mission wasn't done. He had never found the woman who had slept with him, using him for information before drugging him and ordering the attack on his pride. A fragment of the man he had once been broke through the ice in his chest, whispering to let the snow leopard go and resume his hunt for the Archangel woman. Whatever this female had done, it would be nothing compared with the sins of the Archangel huntress. That woman deserved death for the act she had committed. Images flashed across his eyes, a disjointed layer over the present, distorting and twisting the club into a forbidding yet breathtaking white landscape with the snow leopard female at the center of it, her short black hair blowing in the frigid wind that scoured the treacherous barren terrain. She turned her head towards him, and bright sunlight bathed her face, intensifying the gold in her eyes until they glittered like precious metal. Her soft pink lips parted, flashing a hint of straight white teeth, as she tipped her chin up and stared straight into his eyes. For a heartbeat, a mere split second of time that felt like a fantasy or foolishness as it fled, she was more breathtaking than the icy mountainous world around her. She belonged in that world, a queen of all she surveyed, a beautiful and beguiling creature with whom few could contend, a majestic female. The mountains beyond her shook, blurring as they vibrated and rocked the earth, sending snow plummeting down their cragged faces. The air hummed around him. The bright sun faded. The female dipped her head, raising her hands at the same time, and his stomach revolted when he saw the blood coating them. He squeezed his eyes shut and shoved the heels of his hands against them for good measure, trying to shut out the horror he knew would come next. His left shoulder burned, the healing wound there threatening to reopen. Again. He breathed deep as he whirled into her place, staring down at his blood-stained hands. Images flooded his mind, replaying the night before, when he had watched the female for hours in the club, before succumbing to a dark hunger that had ruled him, driving him into obeying and feeding it. A hunger that was rising within him again now, demanding he head out just as he had last night and go on the hunt, using all of his skills to track down the hunters from Archangel that infested London. It was a need born of the memories that surged within him whenever he looked at the female snow leopard. He had shut out everything that had come before the long dark months when he had hunted Archangel in the aftermath of the attack on his pride, sealed it away inside him and pushed it down deep. All of his softer emotions, every shred of feeling he had ever possessed. He had thought all of it dead and gone, but he could feel it reawakening inside him. He could feel it pushing at the walls he had constructed, and if they broke, it would be as if a dam had burst. He wouldn't be able to handle the flood. It would destroy him. He needed to leave again, had to get away from the female and go out as he had last night, pursuing the cold calm that came in the moment before the kill. He craved it even more now, twitched with the need to bathe his hands in Archangel blood, satisfying his deepest, darkest hungers. 3 had died last night, and he could barely remember their faces, only had a series of brief images to remind him of what he had done, the rest of it buried deep within his subconscious, burned from his mind. Screams erupted in the club, and he sensed the swarm of signatures rushing towards him, crowding him and pushing at his control. He snarled through his short fangs, trying to warn them away, needing the space they were consuming in their mad panic. Harbin flicked his eyes open, and they settled on a male clad in black combat gear, similar to what he wore when he was carrying out the final phase of a mission. Only this male was no fae or demon. He was mortal. Archangel. Emotions bombarded Harbin on seeing the 24 strong mortal males surging through the room, firing on the fae in it with tranquilizer guns and crossbows, or lashing out with their black batons. He pushed from his stool, his left leg aching under the sudden weight, and growled as he shoved the people attempting to flee away from him, clearing his space around him. His claws lengthened at the same time as his fangs. A young male demon went down hard at the edge of the dance floor, a dart sticking out of his left shoulder. Harbin's blood burned, his heart laboring as he struggled to get enough air into his lungs. He shook with a need to unleash his snow leopard side and tear through the room. The urge stronger than it had ever been, fueled by the constant awareness of the weaker female in the club with him. His gaze sought her, locating her as she broke free of the throng of people to his left and made a run for it. She was agile and swift as she darted through the people, and he silently willed her to make it unseen to the main exit where a large male he recognized as a fellow shifter was stumbling into the club, shaking his head as he tried to rid it of the lingering effect of whatever dart the hunters had used on him. They should have plugged him with more than one. The big bear roared as he tore off his t-shirt, and Harbin cursed him as all the hunters swung towards him. 2 males spotted the female. Harbin pushed off, unable to ignore the pressing need to protect her. One of the hunters hit her with a dart in her right thigh. She stumbled, a high shriek leaving her lips, but kept running, limping towards the bear as he started to shift. The second hunter pursued her. Harbin growled and hobbled faster, cursing himself now. He needed to shift, his cat form being his stronger one in this situation, but he couldn't when his tibia was still healing. The shift would break the weakened bone, leaving him in a worse condition than he was now and making it impossible for him to fight. The second male caught the female as she slowed, the drugs taking effect, and Harbin flinched as the hunter dealt a blow across the back of her head with his baton. She crumpled, hitting the floor in a tangled heap. Pain pierced Harbin's right arm and hip, but it felt like little more than a brief sting as memories surged in response to seeing the female go down. They rolled through him, ripping an agonized howl from his throat as he stumbled forwards, blinded by the pain and the fury, filled with a hunger to destroy every Archangel hunter he could see. This was his fault. He had hunted down Archangel members, all of them too young to have had anything to do with the attack on his pride. He had needed the kill, though. He had needed the serenity of shutting down his feelings and focusing on a mission. He hadn't thought it would trigger an attack on the Fae community, but it couldn't be coincidence that Archangel had targeted the very club where he had been seen 2 nights in a row. Someone had witnessed the attack and survived to tell the tale. Archangel had come after him, for retribution, and now innocents were being dragged into a living hell again because of him. The male grabbed her by her arms and hauled her into them, slinging her over his shoulder. Harbin growled weakly and kept pushing forwards through the emptying club. Several of the hunters left, carrying unconscious Fae in pairs. At the exit, 3 were attempting to handle the bear shifter. 5 darts stuck out of his bare chest, and a nervous hunter embedded a 6th before a braver one dared to approach the slumbering brute. A sudden sinking sensation washed through Harbin as he realized that the hunters were leaving, taking his quarry with them. His stomach squirmed, his instincts telling him to flee while he had the chance, to save his skin and escape whatever nightmare awaited the poor bastards at the hands of the Archangel hunters. He pinned his feet to the floor and scrubbed a hand across his blurry eyes, trying to see the female as his body battled the effects of the drugs. She hung limp over the shoulder of the hunter, her head lolling around and arms swaying with each measured step he took. It would be easy to turn away, to slink into the shadows and wait for the tranquilizers to wear off. His body was already purging them, too strong for the puny doses they had used on him. He sighed, shook his head. He couldn't, not only because he had gotten her into this mess, but because he didn't know which facility Archangel would take her to, and he would lose her if he let the hunters take her now. He might never find her again, and he had promised Hart that he would carry out his part of the mission. He had vowed that he would remain close to her until Hart and Fury came to finish the job with him. He had to keep that promise if he was going to keep his reputation as one of the best assassins in the guild. He had never lost a mark, and he wasn't going to start now. Not even when it meant placing himself in the hands of the hunters he despised. He scanned the room and spotted a lone male hunter at the back, struggling with a large unconscious male. His gut churned, every instinct he possessed screaming at him to run in the opposite direction. He couldn't. He had to get caught too. A small part of him, a piece of him that refused to die now, whispered that his reasons ran deeper than a need to keep tabs on his mark and fulfilling his part of the mission. He wanted to get caught so he could ensure that she was unharmed by Archangel. He didn't want to let her be alone in that terrible place. He needed to be there too. Harbin roared and hurled himself at the young hunter. The male turned, wide brown eyes filled with panic, and swiftly raised his compact crossbow. Harbin saw the flash of the dart, felt the sting as it pierced his chest, and grunted as he stumbled a step. He pushed onwards, lumbering towards the male, desperate to force him into firing again. He needed the oblivion the tranquilizers offered. He would lose his mind if he had to do this capture and transport in a semi-drugged state. His memories would destroy what little sanity he had left. A second hunter dropped his quarry and joined the first, lashing out with a baton. Harbin staggered right as the blow connected with the left side of his head, pain ricocheting around his skull and turning the world hazy for a moment. He tried to retain his balance, his injured leg crumpled beneath him, and he hit the tacky club floor hard. The 2 males closed in, and every instinct he possessed commanded him to shift and fight. He shut his eyes and surrendered instead, allowing the hunters to crack their batons across his arms and head as he curled into a ball on his side. His snow leopard side pushed for freedom, writhing beneath his skin, wild with a need to attack and protect himself. It took every shred of his will to keep still and take the beating, to not retaliate and kill the males who were battering him. He would find them and kill them after he had fulfilled his mission. His strength faded as the tranquilizers began to take hold, numbing him but not quickly enough to stop the need to escape the hunters and their vile clutches, and the thought of waking to find himself at the mercy of Archangel from driving him mad. Shattered memory fragments bombarded him, filling his mind with a broken replay of blood on snow, crimson drenching white, and the black blur of the hunters who had attacked his kin. He saw their faces, heard their last gasps as he choked the life from them, staring into their eyes so he was the last thing they saw. He saw her. The blonde archangel huntress mocked him with the pretty smile that had addled his lust-fogged, alcohol-impaired brain, luring him under her spell in the small bar in the town nearest to the mountain where his pride had lived in safety for centuries. A peace he had shattered because he had been too full of himself, as headstrong and hot-blooded as his father had always told him he was. He had been too blinded by lust to see the warning signs, had been too tempted by the sinful beauty and the thought of satisfying his carnal hungers. His pain dulled as he slipped into a daze, the tranquilizer dose not enough to knock him out, leaving him at the mercy of his memories. They ran on a constant twisted replay, tormenting him, driving him insane with a need to hunt and kill, a hunger that he was powerless to satisfy in his drugged state. He weakly banged his head against the hard floor, seeking oblivion in order to escape his past, but he didn't have the strength to knock himself out. He was vaguely aware of the hunters as they dragged him from the room, and the faint smell of gasoline as they loaded him into a truck. Lucidity came and went, giving him brief glimpses of holding cells in a darkened space, each filled with an unconscious fae or demon, before the past came rushing back to swallow him. Each time it hit him, it drove him back under the violent tide of his memories. They battered him, turning him inside out with emotions that were still raw, his pain and fury yet to fade. He tried to growl whenever the blonde huntress flashed across his mind, tried to change the course of events whenever he saw her leaning in to kiss him, her emerald eyes glittering with desire. But no sound left his lips, and nothing he did could alter the past. The truck shifted, jostling him so he rolled against the cold metal bars of his cell. The feel of them pressing against his back and the thought of where he was heading combined to overpower him. Fear closed in despite his years of training and honing his abilities as an assassin, the emotion too strong to deny as it swept through him, swamping his mind and flooding it with images of what might await him and the other unlucky bastards in the truck with him when they reached the facility. He tried to move, his instinct screaming at him to break free, to not allow Archangel to take him into a facility where he would be tortured and would possibly die. He hadn't survived this long, hadn't borne the pain for 20 agonizing years for it to end here at their hands. He wouldn't let them win. He snarled and shuffled, managed to get his hands beneath him and convince his body to obey his foggy mind. But he didn't have the strength to push himself off the grotty floor. His arms gave out beneath him, his left shoulder hitting the floor hard enough to rip a pained yelp from his lips. A hunter near the back muttered something and cautiously stalked forwards, heading in his direction. He attempted to feign unconsciousness, but the pain in his shoulder was too intense. The fresh metallic tang of blood permeating the air telling him he had torn the wound open again. He gritted his teeth against it, his jaw muscles flexed, and the next thing he knew was a sharp sting in the right side of his chest as a dart impacted. Strange cold stole through him, numbing as it crept outwards from the impact point. Darkness claimed him. A brief, sweet moment of oblivion, followed by a rude blast of cold water. Harbin snarled and tried to back away from the powerful jet, but a wall blocked his escape. He barked out his pain as the icy water thundered against his injured shoulder, and then coughed as it struck his face, getting in his mouth and up his nose. He flinched away from it, curling against the wall, but it didn't stop his assailants. They kept up with their torment, hosing him down where he sat on the frigid tiles of what seemed to be a bright room. As they ran the hose down his body, he barked again, fire and lightning rocketing up his leg bones as the jet reached his ankle. He growled a curse and swung his gaze towards them, narrowing his silver eyes on them as he breathed hard, struggling against his need to leap to his feet and rip them to shreds. The two young male hunters lost their smiles, their dark eyes turning wary as they backed off in unison. Without a word, the one with the hose switched it off and made a swift exit, followed by his companion. Harbin panted through the pain and gritted his teeth as he looked down at his left leg. The bastards had removed his cast, exposing the deep bruises that marked his skin, and leaving him in danger of re-breaking his tibia if he put too much weight on it. He wouldn't be fighting them any time soon, that was for sure. He needed a few more days before he could risk more than hobbling. He huffed. The bastards knew what they were doing. They knew what he was, who he was. Not only had they taken his cast, which he would have easily stripped back to its base parts to get his hands on the metal rods to use them as makeshift batons, but they had taken his clothes. They had removed everything he might have used as a weapon against them. He flexed his fingers and smiled coldly as his claws extended. Everything except his built-in arsenal, anyway. A shadow flickered out of the corner of his eye, and he lowered his hands and looked towards the only exit in the white room. A larger male blocked the door, his rugged face set in grim lines that Harbin felt matched his own expression. They had sent an assassin to deal with him, one of their finest, no doubt. Only the best for him. He bared his fangs at the male. The bastard simply raised the dart gun in his hand and squeezed the trigger. 4 times. Harbin grunted as each dart impacted in his injured shoulder and his chest. Cold swept outwards, turning his mind to mush and his limbs to rubber. He slumped against the wall, his head striking it hard, and his hands fell to his lap. He was vaguely aware of the hunter as he advanced, and the rough way he jerked him onto his feet. Icy tiles slammed against Harbin's face, and cool metal encircled his wrists behind him, locking them in place. He struggled, one weak and pathetic attempt at fighting back that did nothing but make the Archangel hunter chuckle in his ear. Harbin's hackles rose. He would take pleasure in making this one suffer when he was free of this wretched place. It rang around his mind as he stumbled through blurred corridors, beat deep in his blood as he heard the whispers and snickers of other Archangel members and felt their eyes on him, felt them mocking him. The drugs the hunter had pumped him with were already fading by the time he smelled other Fae and knew he was near the detention block, his new home for the foreseeable future. He bit back a growl as someone commented as he staggered onwards, feeling as if he had hit a tavern for a few too many beers and was paying the price. The mighty have fallen. He hadn't fallen, not yet. He would prove that to them when he escaped this hell. He would show them all that he was as dangerous as the reputation that preceded him, as wild and feral as the legends told. He would bathe in the blood of Archangel as he tore this facility to the ground. He stumbled down a set of steps into a long white corridor and bumped off a wall. His escort shoved him in the back and he snarled over his shoulder at him. The male grabbed his shackled wrists and twisted. Harbin grunted, biting back the cry that tried to leave his lips as his shoulder caught fire. The pain instantly faded, the anger that blazed within him dying as he felt eyes on him. A familiar piercing that seemed to ground him and lift the haze from his mind, freeing him from the torment of his memories and his seething need for bloodshed. His gaze swung towards the source of the soothing feeling. The snow leopard female sat tucked in the back of a bright white cell with a thick glass front, hugging her black denim-clad knees to her chest, her silver-gold eyes tracking him. His heart beat harder, an insatiable hunger instantly awakening in his blood, drumming fiercely in his veins. His guard was down, stripped from him by the drugs and the pain, and he couldn't deny one thought as it speared his very soul. She was beautiful, and he was meant to kill her. Fresh agony rolled through him, stirred by the thought of taking her life. It collided with the anger roused by the sight of her confined in a cell and at the mercy of Archangel. He growled, flashing his fangs at her. She continued to stare at him, unflinching in the face of his fury. Brave female. Would she be so brave when Archangel came for her? The thought of her being dragged from her cell, pulled into whatever twisted experiments awaited her, churned his stomach until it boiled like acid, and he wanted to take his claws to the male behind him and every other person in the building. He turned away from her and stared at the white-tiled floor. Would she be so brave when she faced him and knew her life was going to end? What he had planned for her was surely far worse than anything Archangel could dish out, but perhaps it was more merciful. He liked to think so anyway. A wry smile curled his lips. He wasn't sure whether that made him fucked up or not. Was it better he gave her a swift death rather than her being subjected to Archangel's demented experiments? A swift death was surely preferable. He tipped his head back and stared up at the ceiling. He certainly preferred it. But the thought of Archangel doing anything to a snow leopard turned his insides and hollowed him out, scraping away all of the softer feelings she had stirred in him, and leaving him raw with a need to butcher them all. And he would. The hunter shoved him into an empty cell, and the glass barrier dropped from the ceiling before he could turn to attack him. The male stared coldly at him and pressed a button on a small black device. The shackles beeped and opened, dropping to the ground behind Harbin. He slammed his palms against the thick glass, right in front of the hunter's face, but the male didn't even twitch. Harbin placed him right at the top of the list of people he would kill the moment he was free. And he would do it with the very shackles the male had placed on him. He turned towards them, a smile playing on his lips as he thought about using them to rip open the bastard's carotid. A panel in the ceiling swished open, a hum sounded, and the shackles shot up into the dark opening. A tugging sensation in Harbin's left thigh had his fingers dropping to stroke the neat inch-long surgical scar there. Magnets. He should have known they would have a way of retrieving the shackles. He hobbled across to the back of his cell, eased down to the floor, and kept stroking the scar, sensing the tracker buried deep beneath his skin. Hart would be coming. Hart would find him. He had 2 days. He could bear whatever hell Archangel intended to put him through in that time. He would survive, and he would make sure his mark survived with him. Harbin closed his eyes, seeking the rest he needed to heal his body and ensure he was fit to fight when the time came. But only horror awaited him. Chapter 5. The sound of screaming wrenched Aya from the tight grip of her nightmare. She breathed hard, sweat trickling down the valley between her breasts and her spine under her silver halter top, her wide eyes fixed unseen on a point across the room from her. It took her a moment to remember where she was and realize that she hadn't been the one to scream. The harrowed sound came again, a desperate bellow that made her shiver and chilled her to the bone. The male snow leopard. Whatever tormented him, it was infinitely worse than the nightmare she had been living in her sleep. Were the hunters hurting him? Or were his agonized screams the product of a deeper suffering? Aya hadn't failed to notice the darkness in him when the big hunter had marched him past her cell. She had thought him more handsome in the full light, but there had been ice in his eyes that had made her cold inside. One look into his pale silvery eyes had left her feeling he had no emotion in him, no shred of feeling, that whatever life he led, it had drained him of all light and left only darkness behind. But the way he was screaming, each bellow speaking of agony and suffering, left her with a different feeling. Whatever emotions he had, they had been buried deep beneath that mountain of pain. She could relate to that. She had fallen into a violent abyss of nightmares shortly after seeing him paraded past her cell, stripped bare and exposed to the eyes of all, as if the hunters wanted to humiliate him for some reason. The twisted visions of her past had held her firmly in their grasp for the gods only knew how many hours, and mingled in with them had been images of the other captives being tortured by Archangel, experimented on as the scientists attempted to uncover their species' deepest secrets to use as weapons against their kind. Rocky. Aya pulled her knees up to her chest, rubbed her fingers over the smooth denim of her jeans, and brought her focus to the world around her. Rocky was somewhere in this cell block, trapped in a tiny white box just like her. What would Archangel do to him? The need to see him pushed her onto her hands and knees, and she crawled to the glass front of her cell. She pressed her cheek to the barrier and peered down the corridor, but she couldn't see into the other cells. She could only see the one opposite her, and it was empty right now. She felt sure it had been occupied last night by an unfamiliar woman. What had Archangel done with her? Had they released her? Aya scoffed at that and her misguided hope. She knew Archangel, and she knew better than to believe them capable of releasing their captives without a damn good reason. They said they merely studied species in order to understand them, to document them and discover methods of swiftly dealing with any from their kind who broke the laws and became a threat to the humans or other Fae. They lied. She had seen the other side of Archangel with her own eyes. She knew that most of the captives in the cells around her would never see the outside world again. "Rocky," she whispered, and laid her left palm on the several inches of glass, trying to reach through it to the other side so she could sense whether he was nearby. Her stomach churned, hunger and fear combining to turn the acid into a bubbling pit. She closed her eyes and sighed out her breath, clinging to the fragile strands of hope because she couldn't give up. She had to keep believing that Rocky would be fine, and so would the others. A hot shiver coursed through her. Aya opened her eyes and lifted them, settling them straight on the male in the corridor. Gods, he was handsome. The bright lights made his sweat-soaked, scruffy silver hair shimmer, and his eyes almost glow as he hobbled along the stark white hallway, his lips firmly pressed together in a way that spoke of pain. He was trying to control it, but the edge to his gaze said that he was losing that battle. His expression twisted and darkened, and his shoulders and biceps bulged as he shifted his bound wrists behind his back, as if he was flexing his fingers, readying his claws. The ice-cold look in his stunning eyes as they fell to her sent a warning arrowing through her, causing her instincts to fire back a response that told her to keep her distance from him. This male meant war. She could almost read every dark fantasy running through his mind, could almost smell the blood of these hunters and see it splashing up the walls, streaking the pristine white with crimson. He wanted to kill the men behind him, and gods, there was a part of her that wanted to see him do it. Profane lips peeled back off his short fangs as he growled, and she instinctively lowered her gaze, obeying his command to avert her gaze from him. Big mistake. Taut square slabs of pectoral muscles, dusky nipples, and ropes of abdominals caught her eyes. She swallowed hard and tried to look away, but the way his muscles shifted with each step he took held her fast and fascinated her. Each bunch and stretch, each flex spoke of power, and she couldn't stop her body from responding to it, heating and beginning to burn as her eyes betrayed her and slowly drifted down the length of his 8-pack to the dusting of silver hair that trailed onwards. A stark reminder that he was naked, one that had her eyes finally leaping away from him and fixing on the floor at his bare feet. She frowned as he limped past, her eyes drawn to his left leg and the mottled skin above his ankle. He had broken it. How? Her mind supplied that it had been in a fight, because by the looks of his body he fought often. She might have been enraptured by his incredible physique, but that instant spark of lust he had ignited within her hadn't made her blind. She had seen the silvery streaks that covered his skin. The sight of them stirred remembered voices in her head, whispers that had gone through the club the first night he had appeared in it. He was an assassin. Who was his target? His gaze burned into her, but this time she felt only cold. She knew the answer to that question. The hunters weren't the only ones in this building that he was thinking about killing. She was his target. Aya lifted her head and pinned her gaze on the back of his head, refusing to let her instincts rule her. She wouldn't back down where this male was concerned. He had no power over her, and she was going to show him that he had chosen the wrong female to target. She was stronger than she looked. Snow leopard females were weaker than their male counterparts, but what she lacked in physical strength, she made up for in mental. Males were ruled by their animal side, driven by it to get physical in a fight and tackle things head-on. If he wanted to tussle with her, she would use all of her wits and agility to place him at a disadvantage and emerge the victor. She watched him until he had disappeared from view and lingered for long minutes afterwards, her mind churning, a collision of wondering about the male's history and wondering what Archangel would do to him. A weight settled in her stomach as she thought about him strapped to the black padded table in one of the small medical rooms, sedated and at the mercy of Archangel scientists. Memories bubbled up, and she fought to suppress them, tried to keep them shoved down deep inside of her where they couldn't hurt her. They were too powerful, easily breaking to the surface of her mind and swallowing her. The world around her faded, replaced by a startling splash of crimson on white tiles and the horrifying whir of a bone saw. Aya shoved away from the dark memory, pushed away from the glass, and threw up. A passing guard merely glanced at the mess she had made and then her, and continued on his way down the white corridor. She backed away into the corner of the room where she had slept and curled into a ball, wrapping her arms around her knees and bringing them up to her chest. Time trickled past as she stared at the corridor, not really noticing the guards as they came and went, or the fae they escorted. It was only when she felt the male snow leopard's eyes on her that she came out of her daze and lifted her eyes away from the spot on the tiled floor. His eyes were even colder now, glacial. They froze her with just a look. Blood tracked down his bare chest from several dark marks, running in drying rivulets over his stomach, where they disappeared beneath a pair of black cotton trunks. Aya stared at them. It seemed Archangel had deemed him worthy of a little dignity, a reward for playing along and letting them run tests on him. She would have done anything they asked had their positions been reversed, and she had been the one stripped naked. Just the thought was enough to have her trembling, memories of her previous time in Archangel's hands surging back to the surface to torment her. She hugged her knees harder and rocked as she fought the onslaught, refusing to let it own her. She was stronger now, a survivor. Nothing would destroy her. The male's eyes narrowed, a flicker of curiosity breaking through the ice, and then he was gone, stolen from view as the two hunters dressed in black fatigues marched him back to his cell. An assassin. She still found that difficult to believe. Whenever she looked at him, she saw a dangerous male, one that she knew she should keep her distance from, but one that she found impossible to put out of her mind. There was something about him, something held just beneath the surface, that told her he wasn't all he appeared to be. He was more. Maybe she had been wrong about him. Aya lowered her head and squeezed her eyes shut. It didn't matter what feelings she had about him. He was an assassin, and he was after her, and that was reason enough to keep her distance and remain wary of him. She had to stop thinking about him as anything other than an enemy, a male who would kill her in a heartbeat. She needed to get her mind off him. A welcome distraction from her darkened, worrying thoughts appeared in view from the right side of her cell. A huntress Aya knew. The pretty blonde led a group, her pale eyes fixed ahead of her along the corridor. Behind her, a large shirtless male trudged, his hands shackled in front of him and two guards at his back. Long, rich brown hair laced with gold and held at the nape of his neck by a leather thong, and the smooth but sculpted contours of his face painted a picture of sinful perfection, an image even she wasn't unaffected by, as his wicked lips quirked and he briefly glanced her way. Heat speared her, spreading outwards from her chest, and she muttered a curse. An incubus. The effect he had on her, and the lines of markings that ran up the underside of his corded forearms and snaked over his biceps and shoulders, were definite traits of an incubus, but it was his eyes that were the dead giveaway. No other fae species had eyes that swirled gold and blue like his were. He shifted them back to the woman in front of him, and Aya couldn't miss the brief tensing of the huntress's shoulders. His markings shimmered with hues of bright gold and cerulean. Was he using his charms on the huntress? Aya had seen her more than once in the city, but had never seen her shaken as she was now. She wasn't the usual confident and cold female Aya knew. Her face was a mask of cool and collected, but her eyes betrayed her. They edged to her left, as if she wanted to look back at the incubus behind her. Maybe he had already used his charms on the huntress and she was still fighting the effects. Aya's gaze drifted back to the incubus. The way he was looking at the huntress, though, and his calm demeanor, left Aya feeling that something was going on and stirred her curiosity. She uncurled and leaned forwards, eager to study the male as much as she could before he too disappeared from view. There wasn't a scratch on him, and the relaxed way he walked said he was comfortable with his situation. He hadn't fought Archangel when they had captured him. Why? She frowned. Because he had wanted to be captured. Aya glanced between him and the huntress and back again. She knew that look he was giving the female. It spoke of hunger, but also of a deeper desire, one not born from lust, but from the heart. He knew the huntress. Aya went to look back at her, but she moved beyond the left wall of her cell, and the incubus soon followed. Was there more to the huntress than met the eye? She'd always had a suspicion that there was something different about her. Her scent wasn't quite right. It wasn't quite mortal. Another group moved into view, and she studied this one with even deeper curiosity. Speaking of not mortal, the black-haired huntress held her head high, her amber eyes focused and intense. But Aya could sense the flicker of fear that she was trying to hide as she stormed along the corridor. This one didn't belong here. She had heard rumors about her. Sable was the hot topic of conversation in every fey bar and club in the city, and beyond. Aya didn't know what blood ran in her veins, but the rumors said it was mortal mixed with something powerful. The Dark Huntress's lineage wasn't her only reason for being on her guard. The great big brunette, bare-chested male stalking the corridor behind her, an unconscious blue-haired male slung over his thickly muscled broad shoulders, was her number one reason. A demon king. The rumors were true. Sable was mated to the third king. The brute snorted and shifted the male, jostling him. Aya wasn't sure what breed the unfortunate male was, but she pitied him. It was wrong of a female and male of the fey world to assist in the capture of one of their own. Aya's stomach squirmed, her anger immediately dissipating as a quiet voice whispered through her mind and chilled her blood. She couldn't pass judgment on the couple, because she had committed the same sin. Chapter 6. Whatever cocktail of drugs they had given him, it really fucked with his control. Harbin prowled his white cell, attempting to work off the adrenaline caused by the nice round of studying he had been subjected to in the grim operating room that had been his own personal hell for what had probably been several hours but felt like several days. He had been a damned good boy in that wretched torture chamber, behaving himself so Archangel wouldn't have reason to get feisty and do more damage than necessary. As much as he wanted to rip all their heads off and piss down their necks, he needed his strength more if he was going to make it through the next 2 days. Surviving until Hart came for him and the mark was priority one, but the longer he spent in the whitewashed hell of this facility, the closer he danced to losing his mind, and the harder it became to deny the base urges welling up to consume him, the worst of which was the itch to fuck. Being a snow leopard male on the cusp of sexual maturity blew most days, but it was made infinitely worse by the presence of the female. He hadn't noticed the effects when he had been back at the club, surrounded by the swirling thick scents of the other fae, and unable to see the female clearly in the flickering, piercing, colorful lights. But fuck did he notice it now that he had seen her several times under bright, clear light, all of her damned beauty and lush, plump curves revealed to him. And fuck did he really notice it now that his senses had honed in on her particular scent. She was all he could smell. Even when Archangel had been working him over, prodding and poking him while questioning him about hell and everything else he had seen in his short life, he hadn't been able to smell anything but her. Not the disgusting stench of antibacterial products, nor the rank odor of the sweaty little humans so eager to divulge his darkest secrets. He could only smell the sweet, subtle scent of mountain air that he now associated wholly with her. God, she smelled like home, and it was playing havoc with him. He turned and slammed his fist into the glass of his cell, pain ricocheting violently through his bones in response. The fiery zing gave him sweet respite from his turbulent feelings for a second, a brief moment in which he felt calm again and steady, centered. A hiss sounded and he jerked his head up, his eyes narrowing on the pale vapor as it descended into the cell from above the door. It seemed Archangel employed nefarious tactics to deal with naughty prisoners. Harbin didn't back away from the gas as it rolled towards him like a menacing fog. He closed his eyes, kept his head tilted back, and inhaled, taking the foul-tasting toxin deep into his body. He wanted oblivion. He wanted to sleep through this nightmare. His legs wobbled, turning to jelly beneath him, and gave out a second later, sending him crashing into a heap on the ground. Sounds spiraled around him, voices blending together into nothing more than a blur of noise. Darkness encroached, and he welcomed it, reached out to pull it closer as his body succumbed to the effects of the gas. Sweet, sweet fucking oblivion. He smiled as he slipped into it. A sharp bang rattled him from the gentle cradle of darkness, its tender arms slipping free of him as light washed back into his mind. He groaned and rolled onto his side, curling into a ball for a moment before stretching out, reaching his limbs as far as they could go. Every muscle lengthened and warmth burned through him, a satiated feeling that could only come from a deep and restful sleep. He kept his eyes closed and assessed his condition as he continued to stretch, unable to deny his base instincts as pleasure rolled through every inch of him. There really was nothing like a good stretch. Most days he denied himself that unearthly pleasure, but this time he indulged it, reveled in it. Gods, it felt good, but not quite good enough to erase his awareness of his surroundings, or of his new neighbor. The male muttered to himself, and it took Harbin a moment to regain enough of his faculties to decipher his tongue and understand what he had said. "What is this magic?" Harbin snorted, managed to convince himself to stop with the fucking stretching, and sat up. "It's called glass, dumbass." There was a deep pause, and he wondered whether the male had heard him. "Are you dragon?" The words came from his left, muffled by the white wall between them, but clear enough that they could have a conversation. He had to be going mad if the thought of conversing with someone actually made his day look bright and sunny, when in reality it was stormy and dangerous as all fuck. But still, the guy was a dragon, and dragon shifters were damned powerful. They also didn't belong in the mortal realm, which Harbin decided the male hadn't quite figured out yet since he seemed rather calm. A softer banging sound told Harbin the male was tentatively exploring his surroundings. If they were going to have a conversation, then he would have to move closer to the dragon. He lumbered onto his feet and placed a little more weight than usual on his left leg. It ached less, the throbbing barely noticeable now. The sleep caused by the gas had done him some good, helping rejuvenate his tired body. If only Archangel knew. He grinned to himself. The bastards wouldn't have knocked him out, that was for sure. They probably wanted to keep him nice and weak, easy to manage, so he would behave himself whenever they decided to take him from his cell and prod at him. He ran his thumbs around the elastic waist of his black trunks. At least his good behavior had given him back one item of his clothing. Maybe he could get the rest back if he continued to play nice. Not that nudity bothered him. Plenty of his captors had stripped him bare in order to leave him with only his built-in weaponry, and he had managed to kill them all and escape. Even the ones who had attempted to pull his claws out had met with a grisly end. Harbin limped to the left wall of his cell and leaned there near the glass front. "Nope, not a dragon. But it helps in my line of business if you know your languages." He had met enough dragons in hell to know it paid to speak their tongue. Their English was often more than rough around the edges, and the last thing he wanted was a 60-foot reptile with a temper misunderstanding him. No assassin crossed a dragon. Well, none that lived to tell the tale anyway. He was sure some idiots thought they could tackle a mark of that magnitude and that their target ate them and used their bones as toothpicks. "Where am I?" The male's voice grew louder, and Harbin could almost sense him on the other side of the wall, resting close to him. He was powerful. Too powerful for the cell to hold if he lost his temper? The thought of escaping and grabbing the female snow leopard in the panic had his heart leaping in his chest, and he had to draw a deep breath to settle himself. He wasn't in any danger. He didn't have to fear Archangel or give in to a need to escape that only made him weak and pathetic. Hart was coming. And fuck, for once Harbin couldn't wait to see Fury. The mad bastard would tear Archangel a new one when he popped into the facility with their boss, and Harbin wanted to see the dark elf rip through the mortals with his sword. He wanted to put them to his own blades, too. Harbin pushed the pleasing image aside and focused on his neighbor. Maybe he could get some information out of him or use him to his advantage in some way. He just had to push his buttons a little. A complex filled with bastards. From the twittering I've heard during the past day, they're quite excited about you. Lies, but probably the truth. Archangel got excited about anything rare landing in their hands, and you didn't get rarer than a dragon shifter, which led Harbin to wonder how the hell they had gotten their dirty paws on him. Where is Anais? There was desperation in those 3 words, and it gave all of the dragon's feelings away. He felt deeply for whoever Anais was, and the maturing side of Harbin could appreciate that, his screwed-up instincts finding it sweet and appealing. He didn't need a damned mate. There was no time for love in his life, and bitches definitely didn't deserve a drop of affection from him. Females were traitorous, backstabbing whores. She a dragon too? Harbin ground the words out as politely as he could manage, given the anger churning in his gut, the fury roused by the thought of the female who had betrayed him. She had used her wiles on him, had seduced him into believing she was attracted to him and desired to be with him. He had been stupid enough to think she was being honest, that she might be more than a tumble in the hay. The barbs of her lies still stuck in his heart, slowly working deeper, tearing it apart. He growled under his breath and clawed at his chest, struggling for air as he tried to regain control of his mind and shove her from it. She is mortal. Those 3 words sent him back over the edge, and he stumbled away from the wall, mind reeling as he stared blankly at the other side of the cell. Mortal. A cold shiver ran through him, followed by a hot blast of anger. They had done it again. They had sent a female to seduce a fey male, no doubt in order to capture him for one of their studies. He snarled through his fangs, plowed his fingers into his silver hair, and yanked on it as the anger inside him coiled tighter, burned hotter. The flames ate away at his control, shattering his mind and turning his heart to ash in his chest as everything came flooding back. The bar, the beauty, the betrayal. He collapsed to his knees and curled forwards, unable to breathe as those terrible memories washed over him, racking his tired body and tearing him to pieces. He tried to hold himself together, scrambling to gather each broken piece of his soul before the memories leaped forwards, but he wasn't swift enough. White snow, red blood. His beloved mother and sister, their sightless eyes staring at the heavens, to the place where they roamed free with their ancestors, stolen from him too soon. Hot tears rolled down his face as he grimaced, clenching his teeth against the pain ripping him apart. Still raw, still killing him slowly 20 years on. The blood of his kin, the cries of those who had survived the brutal attack on his pride, the look in his older brother's eyes as he lifted them from their dead mother and sister and set them on him across the frigid square. Gods, Kavanaugh had known it had been his fault. Harbin had seen it then. He had seen the disappointment and disgust, the anger, the pain. He had done the only thing he could. He had gone after Archangel, mad with a need to make them pay. He remembered little of what had happened in the aftermath of the attack, only the taste of blood, the feel of bones breaking and skin rupturing beneath his claws, and the overwhelming urge to keep fighting, until all were dead. That urge still lived within him. It still took him whenever he crossed paths with an Archangel hunter, and he still lost his mind when he killed them, remembering only fragments of what happened, engulfed by his rage and his pain. Harbin growled and fought the dark need as it rose inside him, threatening to drive him insane. He could smell the Archangel hunters, could sense their presence around him, but he couldn't reach them. If he succumbed to his urges, he would only lose his mind, unable to satisfy his deep craving to spill their blood. He had to retain control. Voices blurred around him, a female and the dragon's. The huntress had come to him, but Harbin was too deep in the grip of his memories to make out what they were saying to each other. He breathed deep and clawed back control, focusing on his need to hear what was being said, because it might end the attack ravaging his mind and body. If he could only hear she hadn't betrayed him, he needed to hear. A different male voice joined the blur, and he caught the words study and shift. He twisted his hair in his fingers and focused on those two words. They wanted to study the dragon. They wanted to see him shift. It wasn't possible. No dragon could shift in this realm. The curse placed on them millennia ago made it impossible. It also made the male's time limited. If he didn't escape, he would die here, not because of Archangel's experiments, but because this realm would kill him. "I'm sorry." A soft female voice rang through the glass, and Harbin heard the hurt in it, pain that spoke to him and softened the harder parts of him for a heartbeat before he closed himself off again. A female could easily sway a male with a few sweet and well-chosen words. It meant nothing. Harbin only hoped the dragon could see through them too. "I am sorry too." Those 4 words spoken by the shifter carried a weight of bitterness, hurt, and hatred, and Harbin breathed easily at last. The male was wiser than Harbin had hoped. He wasn't sorry the bitch had betrayed him. He was sorry he had ever met her. The huntress who had used and betrayed Harbin wouldn't receive such a simple ending. His closure needed blood and death, and he wouldn't be sorry about it. Harbin closed his eyes. Escape, the mission, and then revenge. He's coming. He's coming. He's coming. Escape, the mission, and then revenge. He lost himself as he chanted those words, so focused on them that they filled his mind and left no room for any other thoughts. They consumed him, drove him, and no matter how much he tried, he couldn't stop saying them. A passing guard looked in on him, and Harbin lifted his head, bared his fangs, and kept chanting. The hunter gave him a look that said he had gone mad. Mad. Yes, definitely mad. But not insane. Driven, obsessed. A madness that kept him walking forwards, forever onwards in search of the one elusive female. The one death that would free him of the compelling urge to butcher Archangel hunters and make them pay for their sins that was beginning to consume him again. He had lost sight of his true mission, but now a need to fulfill it ruled him, had him in its grip again. This time he wouldn't set it aside for anything. This time he would complete it and the huntress would die. It ended now. He shoved onto his feet and began pacing, taking swift, agitated strides across his cell, as the thought of finding the bitch who had betrayed him and killed his kin spawned 1,000 more thoughts. An account of all the knowledge he had gained during his search for her across all the continents of the mortal realm. Somewhere in that knowledge was the seed that would bear fruit and give him her location. He just had to find it. His fingers flexed, twitching with the need to sink his claws into her. Escape. Fuck the mission. Get revenge. That was all that mattered now. Escape and revenge. It was time she paid for her sins. He sharply turned towards the wall separating him and the dragon and banged on it. Time to sow some seeds of his own, ones that might just get him out of this whitewashed hell. "That the woman you were looking for?" he said. "Yes." Harbin snorted. "They sent a woman to trick you too." Silence greeted that question, and he could almost hear the dragon's thoughts, could almost taste his freedom. He was close. He just had to push the male a little more. He had to play on his feelings, both the good and the bad. "Did she sleep with you and then betray you?" He pressed his palms to the wall and waited. The dragon growled. "Yes." Harbin spat out a foul curse. "They did the same thing to me, and then they attacked my pride. They killed my sister and mother." Silence again, and this time Harbin knew the reason. The dragon was thinking about his clan and the danger it was in now. Dragons valued their clan above everything. Well, everything except their treasure. A low snarl rumbled through the wall. The sense of power Harbin got from him increased tenfold, and then the dull sound of fists slamming against glass sounded. The dragon was pissed, just how Harbin needed him. The banging ceased, and he felt the dragon move closer. "What is your name?" Those words were labored, spoken between hard breaths if he had to guess. "Harbin." "My name is Loki. You heard my conversations with the hunters. I cannot be here. I must escape these fiends, and therefore I need your help. I need your knowledge of this facility. Bingo. He had just secured his ticket out of here. Now he just had to give the male what he knew, and escape and revenge would be his. Escape. Revenge. He hadn't realized he had relapsed into chanting about those two things until the damned dragon was roaring down the house and pummeling the glass again. Fuck. Bad move, Harbin called, but he knew it was already too late. They don't like it when we're rowdy. Loki stopped the banging, but the deathly silence in the other cell told Harbin that they were already releasing the gas. He didn't have much time if he was going to convince the dragon to break him out. He growled as he gave the dragon the information he needed, his voice deeper and more vicious than he had ever heard it, as thoughts of finally achieving his revenge rolled through him. Atonement. It would finally be his. 2 scientists. Bonds are weak. Shatter them. Scalpels are weapons. 4 guards. 2 observers. 8 throats to cut. Kill the fuckers and come get me. Harbin grinned and sealed the deal by placing a cherry on the top. I know a portal back to hell. Chapter 7. Harbin couldn't wait to see what the scientists had in store for him this time. He had expected the 2 male hunters at his back to escort him into the same cramped medical room as before, but they had continued along the stark white corridor, leading him deeper into the facility. The shackles they had placed on him were cold against his bare lower back, irritating him. He flexed his fingers, fighting the itch to stroke the surgical scar on his thigh where his implant sat deep beneath the skin. Escape. That instinct rode him now, strengthened by the conversation he'd had with the dragon shifter. It was within his reach. He had been set on escape and revenge until he had passed the cell of the female snow leopard and had seen it was empty. A pressing need to see her again had welled up inside him, startling him with its intensity. Curiosity drove questions through his mind, a hunger to know where she was and what Archangel was doing with her. That hunger filled him with a dangerous need, one that had little to do with his mission and everything to do with his need to atone. He couldn't leave without her. He needed to see her and see she was safe, and know that she would be in her cell when the time came to escape this hell. Whether that escape came at the hands of Heart and Fury or the dragon, he wasn't leaving without her. His fingers itched with another need as he cursed himself, a desire to plow them through his wild silver hair. What the fuck was wrong with him? What had happened to the cool and collected killer? He growled a curse out loud this time. He had been unraveling from the moment he had set eyes on her. He had bottled up everything, every softer feeling or painful memory, and now it wanted to come out. It couldn't have worse fucking timing. He needed to be on his A game right now, at peak strength, with his wits about him. He didn't need to be mooning over a damned female just because his hormones were out of whack and the need to mate was strong. The urges he had been suppressing for the past few years rose to overwhelm him whenever he thought about her, riding him harder than ever. 99 years old. It taunted him. Crossing paths with the female couldn't have come at a worse time. He hadn't believed his teachers or his family when they had told him that as a male, he would hit sexual maturity at a century old. He had thought it bullshit, a rough estimation of the time he would awaken as a fully matured snow leopard adult, able to breed. He had never thought it possible that they were right, and it would hit him at dead on 100. It certainly felt as if it was going to, and if the roller coaster ride he had been on the past few years was anything to go by, it wasn't going to be much fun. He had been keeping his urges under control, never straying close to women when they were at their strongest, trying to rule him. But now they were owning him, pushing back whenever he attempted to wrestle them under his command. His instincts were too powerful, and gods only knew it was because of the presence of the female. How the ever-living fuck was he going to escape with her when his condition was worsening, degrading to a point where whenever he thought about her lush curves and feeling her flesh cushioning his fingers, he got a raging hard-on. He looked down at the front of his black trunks and grunted. It wasn't as if he could hide the damn thing with his current clothing shortage either. Maybe it was better he let Heart and Fury handle her, but that meant handing over control to them. It would place her in danger. Heart and Fury would want to carry out their mission. He snarled at the thought and bared his lengthening fangs. No fucking way. He wanted nothing to do with females, especially not a snow leopard, but he couldn't let them take her from him. He couldn't sign her death warrant. He had to handle her himself. The hunters shoved him into a room, pushing him right out of his thoughts and back to the present. The moment he realized his wrists were unbound, he turned back to lash out at the mortals, but a solid steel door slammed in his face. Great. Another cell. He turned around, and dread slithered over his skin as his eyes took in the new room. What the hell were they up to now? Everything in the large rectangular room with him looked rather unthreatening. Blue plastic barrels, ropes, and boxes were strewn across the white-tiled floor. Did they think he would be tempted to play with the stuff? "Make yourself at home." The male voice barked over an intercom on the left wall, above which was a small camera. They were watching him. He spotted more cameras on the other walls and in the corners of the room, too. They honest-to-gods wanted to see what he would do when faced with all the shit in the room with him. Fuck all, that's what he was going to do with it. Instead of surrendering to his natural curiosity, he started pacing the room, cataloging everything about it. There was a deep gully across the middle of it, cutting it into two squares. He glanced up at the ceiling, at a dark band there. He would bet his left nut that there was a barrier up there, ready to slam shut and divide the room into two. Harbin casually strode away from his end of the room, towards the place where the barrier was hidden in the ceiling, curious to see what would happen. He was within a few paces of the gully when the scent of male snow leopard hit him. His nose tingled, his primal instincts firing and seizing command. He peeled his top lip off his teeth and dragged the air over them, tasting the male's scent. A snarl rose up his throat, and he stalked towards the first item that smelled of the male, a barrel just over the gully on the other side of the room. He halted a few feet from it, stealing back control of his body, and refusing to give in to the need to rub the damn thing to erase the male's scent from it. Archangel were fucking with him. Maybe they wanted to see how long it would take him to cave and let the need to scent mark everything seize control of him. He huffed and forced himself to turn around and walk away, back towards the end of the room that didn't smell of the male. It was a dangerous game they were playing. This close to sexual maturity, the scent of another male affected him deeply, triggering a primal need to fight and fuck, and God's help anyone who was on the receiving end of either of those needs, because he felt like a feral bastard, liable to rip apart an enemy or a bedfellow. He stormed to the steel door and banged his fists against it. He needed to get out. He needed to escape. Fuck waiting for Hart. Fuck the female mark. He had to get to the dragon and get the hell out of this place. He couldn't do it. He couldn't handle any more. The matching steel door at the other end of the room opened, jerking his gaze in that direction, and his stomach dropped as the female snow leopard was shoved into it with him, clad only in a strapless white bra and panties. No. The twin urges to fight and fuck combined into one seething hunger, and he roared as he launched himself in her direction, unable to claw back enough control to stop himself. The terrible urge to escape overrode them all, filling him with a black need to fulfill his mission. He could only watch himself running at her, determined to wrap his hands around her throat and choke the life from her, convinced that he would be free then. He would be free. The glass panel dropped and he slammed into it, cracking his nose on it. The taste of blood coated his tongue, worsening his hunger to fight. He shook his head and gathered his senses, and growled as he attacked the barrier that kept him from his mark. The female shrank back, her gold-silver eyes filling with fear as she brought her hands up to her chest and swallowed hard. Those wide doe eyes pinned on him, burning into him and wrenching him in two directions, tearing him between the hunger to kill and the terrible need to kiss her. Fear. He frowned and looked down at the barrier, and snarled as he spotted the holes in it. He could smell her. Sweet mountain air. His knees weakened. threatening to buckle and send him crashing to the ground as that scent curled around him, seeped into his skin and made him heat from the inside outwards. He shuddered, his body swiftly hardening in response to her tempting smell, his primal instincts hijacking control and leaving him at their mercy. The darker part of himself that had been established in the blackest pits of hell, born of bloodshed and violence, and a constant fight for survival, rose against it, pushing back and flooding him with a terrible need to escape. Kill the mark. Secure his freedom. That was all that mattered. He attacked the glass again, alternating between slamming his fists against it and clawing it. Nothing he did left a mark on the 5-inch thick barrier. He growled and kept up his assault, but it strengthened the hold his primal instincts had on him. The more he fought the barrier, the harder he breathed, and the deeper he took her scent into him, until it filled him completely, and the thought of killing her was replaced with pleasing images of killing whatever male had marked the items in the room with him. In the room with her. His deepest instinct seized control again at that thought, telling him that there was a male in the room with his female, even when the logical part of him could see that there wasn't. It didn't matter how much he told himself that she was alone, and they were the only 2 snow leopards. He couldn't stop himself from pushing away from the glass and tearing into every item on his side of the room that smelled of the male. A male that wanted his female. He roared. He wouldn't let the male have her. She belonged to him. He was vaguely aware of the danger of his thoughts, but nothing he did could douse the needs coursing through him. His more human consciousness was just a passenger as his animal side drove him to destroy everything. He ripped apart the plastic barrels and boxes and raked his claws down the ropes, erasing the male's scent as he left a wake of carnage behind him. When everything on his side of the room was in pieces, he stalked back to the barrier and growled as he attacked it. He had to reach the things on her side. He had to kill the male that wanted his female. The female backed away from him, towards the white wall at the opposite end of the room to him, her fear a palpable thing that beat in his veins as she stared at him through striking wide eyes. He needed to get to her. Blood smeared the barrier as he clawed at it, wild with that need, and he growled weakly as it consumed him, together with a sense of hopelessness and despair that sank its fangs into him and refused to let him go. He needed her, but he couldn't reach her. "Lift the barrier." Harbin's eyes narrowed on the intercom and then the female. She gasped and shook her head, her eyes darting around as she looked for an escape route. Her black hair swayed, brushing pale cheeks that he wanted to stroke to feel their satin softness beneath his fingertips. Desperation flooded her scent, jacking up the fear in it. The barrier started to lift. Harbin didn't wait. He rolled under the gap as soon as it was large enough and sprang to his bare feet on the other side. The primal part of him that wanted to erase the male's scent from the room decided it wanted something else even more. Her. Harbin launched himself across the room, leaping the gap between them in one bound, and slammed against her. He grasped the back of her neck, pressing his short claws into her flesh to hold her in place, and kissed her, swallowing the gasp that left her lips. Her fist struck his bare chest, punching one moment and shoving the next, desperate noises escaping her as she tried to break free of his hold. He kissed her harder, her taste flooding him with pleasure as he dominated her, obeying every instinct he possessed. She tasted forbidden and sweet. Cold washed over his skin and snow rushed down his neck and back like a waterfall. The stillness of the mountains surrounded him. Her warmth met his, penetrating his skin and sinking deep into him together with his kiss, etched on him forever. He groaned and tightened his grip on her, not wanting this to end, intent on taking more of her into him. He needed more of her. Her claws raked down his right cheek, the stinging fire and the tang of blood forcing his primal instinct to have her to recede, replaced by an instinct to defend himself. It was enough to shatter the hold of his hunger. A sickening awareness flooded him, and he staggered backwards, reeling from the mental blow delivered by the horrific realization of what he was doing, forcing himself on her. He didn't stop moving until the wall at the far end of the room struck his back, stopping him from placing more distance between them. He stared at her, breathing hard and shaking. Gods, what the fuck had he been on the verge of doing? The female curled into herself, her head lowering as she turned her side to him and pressed against the far wall, her fall of black hair obscuring her face. Her bare shoulders trembled, and the salty scent of tears reached him, making him feel even more like a bastard. He raised his hand, paused, and lowered it, sure that whatever words he could muster wouldn't be enough to apologize for what he had done. It would be all too easy to blame his hormones, but it would be a lie, because they weren't wholly responsible for how he had acted. He wanted her. He had wanted her before he had smelled her scent or seen her clearly. He knew that now. He had wanted her the moment he had set eyes on her. She rocked him as no other female had, and that frightened him, because he couldn't do this again. He couldn't allow a female to have that sort of power over him. Never again. Harbin spat out a curse as a trickle of red ran down the back of her neck, and swallowed hard as he lowered his gaze to his bare feet, guilt and shame flowing through him, at the same time as a feral need to sink his fangs into that same place and pin her while he mated with her. He laughed, the sound out of place in the strained silence. He was so fucked up. Killing her wouldn't have bothered him at all, but the thought of taking advantage of her had him tied in knots and disgusted with himself. Gods, Hart would be pissing himself laughing if he knew just what twisted shit was going on inside his head and in this room. He pinned his back to the wall and breathed slowly as he waited for Archangel to remove the female from the room. When close to 30 minutes must have ticked past, he realized that they weren't coming to help her. Bastards. They were leaving her at his mercy, even after witnessing what he was capable of doing to her. He curled his fingers into fists at his sides as she shuffled slowly and carefully towards the door on her side of the room, moving as quietly as possible, as if that would stop him from noticing how desperately she wanted to escape him. She pressed one slender hand to it and remained there, tucked close to the cold metal that kept her dangerously within his reach. Another eternity ticked past, and then everything changed. She changed. She turned her head and slid her silvery golden gaze his way, and she was different now. Darker, angry. Was this what Archangel wanted to see? Is this why they had kept her in the room with him? They wanted to see how long it would take for her to turn from fearful female to dangerous woman. She pushed away from the door and came to face him, her posture no longer meek and afraid. She clenched her fists at her bare hips and fixed her unflinching gaze on him. Her chin tipped up and her eyes brightened, turning more silver than gold, her snow leopard side emerging as her emotions grew stronger, darker still. "I know who you are." Harbin stared at her, having trouble taking those 5 words in and making them stick. He had to be hearing things. Her eyes didn't shift from his, and the look in them sent a chill creeping through his chest. He had heard her right. She did know who he was. Which meant, holy shit, that she was part of his pride. He staggered a step towards her, senses reeling and mind racing. "How long have you been here?" A confused crinkle formed above her silvery eyebrows, and then she frowned. "Only as long as you have. This time." This time. His stomach dropped and his blood turned to ice. He had meant how long had she been in London, but she had taken his questions to mean how long had she been in Archangel's hands. He shook his head, not wanting to believe what he was thinking because it would break him, but she nodded slowly, confirming his worst fears. Archangel had captured her 20 years ago. They had put her through hell because of him. She snarled, flashing little fangs, and her eyes turned to liquid silver as fur rippled over her exposed skin. "I hope they give you what you fucking deserve. It took a lot for me to return to this place, but I had to do it." That hit him like a ton of bricks, and he couldn't breathe as she smiled viciously across the room at him. Victoriously. She had lured him into a trap. She had known he was tracking her, knew who he was, and she had gotten herself caught because she had known he would have to do the same in order to stay close to her and fulfill his mission. Son of a bitch. She calmly walked to the steel door of the room and rapped her knuckles against it, and he was unprepared for the deluge of raw emotions that crashed over him when the door opened to reveal no one to escort her on the other side. She wasn't a prisoner, but he was. Harbin roared and kicked off, intent on reaching the traitorous bitch before she slipped beyond his grasp forever. He leaped over every obstacle in his way, but the door slammed shut before he could reach her. He rained blows down on it and a panel slid open, revealing Glass and the female. She donned a robe, wrapped it tight around herself, and glanced over her shoulder at him, not even a flicker of guilt in her eyes. "Why?" he barked, even when the question felt redundant because he already knew the answer. He just needed to hear her say it. Her smile faltered, and something akin to guilt or possibly sorrow entered her silvery eyes. "I wasn't the only one Archangel captured that day. But I was the only one left alive when Archangel was placed into the hands of a person with a more noble vision, one where humans and Fae could live and work in harmony." She pressed her hands to her chest and screwed her eyes shut. Tears slipped down her cheeks, and a stupid part of himself he couldn't quite kill ached with a need to wipe them away, proving just how fucked up he was. "I'm doing it for the ones I had to watch die during my 3 years of captivity. Whether it was a slow and torturous death of the spirit that took them, or a corporeal one through vivisection or poison testing for weapons." Gods! It had been hard enough when he had only had the weight of the deaths of those at the Pride Village on his shoulders, swift ends by steel and bullets. He couldn't bear the weight of what she was placing on them. He pressed his hands to the metal door, his arms shaking and his knees threatening to give out as what she was saying slowly sank in. She lifted her head and looked into his eyes, and he could see that she might have been strong enough to survive whatever horrors Archangel had inflicted on her. But she was haunted by the things she had seen and endured, things that were his fault. "The people around you were the ones who killed your kin by experimenting on them, and killed the others back at our Pride," he bit out, and her expression didn't change, didn't reveal one single emotion to him. It remained flat and cold. He snarled and slammed his fists against the steel that separated them. "Archangel are the ones who fucked up both of our lives. They were the ones who sent a huntress to seduce me, drug me, and betray me. And they were the ones who killed my sister and mother." Shock flitted across her face before she schooled her expression again. She hadn't known the whole story. He could see that now. She hadn't known that he had been used by Archangel. What twisted spin had Archangel put on what had happened back then to make her believe that he was the one who had orchestrated everything? His stomach dropped as the answer hit him. They had told her and the others they had captured that he had sold them out. Her lips parted, but 2 male hunters appeared before she could speak, ushering her away. He stared at her as she walked down the corridor, wedged between the 2 mortals, her arms wrapped around herself. At the last second before she was stolen from view, she looked back over her shoulder at him. A touch of regret shone in her gaze. Harbin's legs gave out and he crashed to the ground, still reeling from everything that had happened and what she had told him. She had lured him into a trap. She had wanted revenge, and for a moment he felt sure that she had thought she had it. But then he had driven a spike into the perfect image that Archangel had painted and made her believe, fracturing it and leaving her doubting the Hunter organization. He couldn't take any pleasure from that, not while his mind was filled with thoughts of everything she and the others Archangel had taken from the village that day must have suffered because of him. Not while his mind kept whispering to him, filling his heart with a suspicion that he couldn't shake. The female had taken out a contract on herself in order to entrap him and have her revenge. He had been betrayed again. Chapter 8. Aya needed air. She couldn't breathe as she rushed through the maze of bright corridors in the palatial sandstone building belonging to Archangel. Hunters eyed her as she hurried past them, her head bent and her short black hair concealing her face, and the tears streaking her cheeks. The events of the past few days had finally caught up with her, the male snow leopard dealing the final blow that sent them all crashing down on her and rattling her. Harbin. Gods, what was she doing? Had he been telling her the truth, or was it just another deception, a lie spun to shake her trust in Archangel? She shoved the flat of her palm against a glass door, and sweet night air washed over her, the coolness of it sending a wave of calm through her as she could finally breathe again. She strode out into the welcoming darkness, heading for the spot in the center of the courtyard where the amber glow of the lights emanating from the rows of windows on the walls of the quadrangle barely reached. Aya tipped her head back and breathed deeply, trying to center herself again and settle her turbulent thoughts and feelings. Her fingers stroked over the soft material of her silver halter top, a methodical rhythm that slowly calmed her. What had she done? It was her fault that Rocky and the others were in the hands of Archangel, and while she had been able to meet with a senior member of staff before her encounter with Harbin and secure their release, she didn't fully trust Archangel to hold true to their word. Not anymore. All because Harbin had shaken her. She had thought herself prepared to handle facing him and finally having her revenge, making him pay for the years she had suffered at the hands of madmen and the close to 2 decades of reliving those nightmarish times that had come afterwards. She had been wrong. With only a handful of words, backed up by the pain that had shone in his silver eyes, hurt that had called to her deepest animal instincts and had made her want to soothe him, he had punched a hole in her beliefs and ripped them apart. She paced the small patch of darkness, the gravel crunching beneath her black boots. Her hands still shook, but not as violently as they had been when she had returned to the small room where her clothes had been waiting for her and had dressed. She had barely been able to fasten the button on her black jeans. It had taken her close to 10 attempts before she had finally managed it. It wasn't only Harbin's words that had shaken her, though. Her lips tingled, and she pressed trembling fingers to them, her breath hot on their tips as she thought about the kiss. She'd had a deal with Archangel, a plan they had agreed on, and they had changed it, twice. When she had contacted them about Harbin, they had agreed on a plan, one where they would wait until 2 days after her call and capture both her and Harbin together, taking them into custody when they were alone outside the club, in order to maintain her cover as just another member of the Fae community. They had promised to do things quietly, and that only the 2 of them would be captured. The senior member of staff she had met with tonight had apologized, stating that it was another operation that had seized her and the others the night after she had contacted Archangel, and she had foolishly believed him, until they had changed the plan again. They had sworn the barrier would remain in place, keeping Harbin separated from her. They had lied, and that only weakened her trust and made her feel they had been lying to her from the start. Harbin had been so swift to enter the room, to cross it and reach her, that she hadn't had time to react. She had been in his arms, her back pressed to the wall and his powerful body caging her before she could move. And then his lips had captured hers, and she had been thrown back close to 40 years to a fumbled first kiss in a snowy mountain village. Aya spat out a curse and dragged her fingers away from her lips. That kiss had meant nothing. He had made that perfectly clear to her then. He felt nothing for her, but that hadn't made it hurt any less when he had betrayed her. She looked back at the doors she had exited. If he had betrayed her. He hadn't been lying when he had said that Archangel had killed his sister and mother, and part of her believed he hadn't been lying when he had said Archangel had used him too. She had already known he had told them the location of the village, but the tale she knew differed from that point. When Archangel had changed hands and she had been set free, a huntress had been sent to speak with her about everything. The pretty blonde female had told her about that night and that she had been there, and that Harbin had been given money and his pride given protection in exchange for 3 males and a female. Archangel hadn't intended to spill blood. They had only fought to defend themselves when the males in the village had attacked them. Aya had believed her. She had been alone, afraid and angry, and she had needed someone to direct that fury at, and the huntress had given her a target. She had directed Aya's anger away from Archangel and made her focus it on one of her own kind. Aya slumped to her knees and stared at the golden gravel, reeling as everything clicked into place. The huntress was the one who had seduced Harbin. Aya could easily see the bastard falling for her beauty, with her glossy blonde waves, shapely figure, and stunning green eyes. And it hadn't exactly taken much convincing for him to fall into bed with anyone back then. A pretty smile and a little flattery, and any female could have had their way with him. Except her. Gods, she hadn't realized just how bitter he had made her, and it only churned the guilt already brewing in her stomach, making her sick. She had believed Archangel because she had been upset with him, filled with jealousy and anger that she had held on to for 20 years after they had kissed. Jealousy and anger that had only grown with each female she had seen him cavorting with in the village, and each trip he had taken down the mountain to slake his lust with the mortals. Maybe she was doomed to place her faith in the wrong people. 40 years ago, she had believed Harbin had felt something for her, and he had crushed that belief. Yet no kiss had ever stirred heat in her veins as his had. She wished with all of her heart that when he had kissed her in the room, that she had felt nothing but cold fury. But that kiss had melted the ice in her veins, and the thick glacier that encased that heart, making her burn for him all over again. Damn him. She knew why he affected her so deeply, too. It had hit her the second she had stepped into the room, and he had looked at her, his eyes bright silver with hunger, need that she felt sure he was probably blaming on his impending maturity, but she knew stemmed from something else. She was his mate. The feeling had drummed through her, an awareness that she had found hard to shake during her time locked in that room with him, and that was impossible to escape even now that she was free and he was probably back in his cell. How long would it be before he realized it too? Would he come after her when his instincts finally told him that she was his fated female? Her heart beat harder, and the walls around her closed in, the darkness choking the air from her lungs, as her instincts roared at her to run. She needed space and time, needed to escape and taste the fresh air of freedom in her lungs. She couldn't do this. She shoved to her feet and eyed the archway cut into the side of the building at the opposite end of the courtyard. Freedom beckoned, but she couldn't convince her feet to move. She had already tried running from him, had fled to this courtyard, but she hadn't been able to outrun her desire for him. It still drummed in her blood, quickening and setting fire to it. Nothing she did could douse those flames now, not with the memory of his kiss branded on her mind and her lips. Gods, she needed to speak to Rocky. She needed to talk to someone. She was going to drown in her thoughts if she didn't. The things Harbin had said kept her pinned in place, and the need to know whether he was telling the truth warred with the desire to pretend those words had never left his lips. She couldn't face the thought that Archangel had lied to her. She had trusted them for too long. After her release, she had begun to work with them as a sort of informant, feeding them information about dangerous immortals. She had believed that by working with them, that she had been protecting the Fae, shifters, and other immortals who wanted to live in peace. She had spent 15 years assisting them. The thought that they might have lied to her to gain her trust, just as they had apparently spun lies of a more wicked nature to Harbin in order to gain his 20 years ago, hollowed out her insides and left her cold. Archangel had put her through 3 years of hell, but the tests they had run on her had been nothing compared with the experiments they had done on the males they had captured with her. While the scientists had put the males through a more physically painful course of experiments, they had labeled her as a more valuable asset because of her gender, and had instead inflicted a round of studying on her that had been invasive and had left her emotionally scarred. She closed her eyes and shut out the images that wanted to bombard her, the memories she did her best to keep contained to her nightmares. That time was in her past now, but some days it still felt as if it had been just yesterday that they had laid her on inspection tables and invaded her body, studying how she differed from a mortal female. The need to run overwhelmed her again, this time born of a deeper fear, one she couldn't brush aside. She couldn't face the pain of rejection all over again. No snow leopard male would ever want her as a mate, could ever feel anything for her, because she had overheard the scientists that had studied her, and the one thing mature males of her species desired was the one thing she couldn't give them. She couldn't bear offspring to help the survival of their species. Aya looked back over her shoulder again, unable to ignore the urge that beat within her, drawing her back to the cell block, back to him. The need to run from him clashed with another need, one that began to grow, becoming strong enough to subdue the urge to flee. She needed to know the truth about everything. She needed to speak with Harbin again, but she wasn't sure he would be rational. He was too different to the male she had known for most of her life. The coldness in him, the darkness that seeped from him and warned her to keep her distance, set her on edge and made her want to obey her instincts and do just that. Was this what life as an assassin did to people? The male she had known back in the village had been filled with life and light, with easy smiles and quick wit. He had been a little wild, but he hadn't seemed capable of cold-blooded murder, and she knew from her research that he had done some terrible things during their time apart. What had driven him to step into such a dark and dangerous life? Her heart whispered the answer to that question. It had shown in his eyes when he had told her that Archangel had murdered his mother and sister. And now she knew of that event. She could see that the times he had been escorted past her cell, his eyes filled with icy darkness, that he hadn't been plotting her demise. He had been fighting his need to attack the Archangel hunters who guarded him, and possibly every other mortal in the building. Archangel had sent him on the dark path to becoming the cold, emotionless assassin she had met in the nightclub, a male who was nothing like the one she had fallen in love with 40 years ago. She needed to speak with him. She turned back towards the doors and the high shrill of an alarm sounded. The lights from the windows on all 3 floors of the building surrounding her flickered as hunters rushed through the corridors, and her heart kicked off at a pace. What was happening? She listened hard, tuning out the wailing alarm in an attempt to detect what had triggered them. Someone screamed. Another joined in, a shriek of agony that was cut short and made her cold inside. It was an attack. Her stomach dropped. She pushed off hard, sprinting towards the glass doors. Harbin. Chapter 9. Harbin paced his cell, his bare feet silent on the cold white tiles. Only the sound of his breathing and the soft swish of his newly reinstated black jeans filled the tense silence. The return of more of his clothes wasn't a good enough exchange this time, not as payment for what Archangel had put him through. Hell, if he was honest with himself, he didn't deserve the damn clothing. They should have stripped him bare again and put him in solitary for what he had done to the female. The darker part of himself rebelled at that thought, pushing back against it, pointing out that she was the reason he was trapped in his own personal hell. She had betrayed him. She had lured him to her, had tricked him into falling into Archangel's hands, and had orchestrated a meeting that had rattled him, all for the sake of revenge. He wouldn't have been as pissed if she had been in the right and events had followed the path she believed they had taken. But they hadn't, and he was furious. He would never have knowingly betrayed his kin, and the fact that she believed he had sat in his gut like acid-coated lead. What sort of male did she think he was? He huffed and strode back across the small cell as his mind flashed images from his past at him, reminders that he hadn't been the most stellar member of his pride. He had never embraced his duties as the son of their alpha, or taken any form of responsibility, or done anything that benefited his people. He had been lax in his studies, lazy in his work, and had spent most of his days in the lead-up to being exiled in the arms of whatever female would satisfy his latest itch to fuck. Gods, he hoped she hadn't been one of the many he had bedded at the Pride, but it would certainly help him understand the weird rush of sensation he'd had when he had been kissing her, and would go some way to explaining why she hated his guts and had been happy to swallow the bullshit Archangel had fed to her. He doubted she would have believed them if they had said his brother Kavanaugh had sold her out or anyone else at the Pride. The devious bastards had probably overheard something she had said about him during her captivity and had used him all over again, painting a big target on his chest for her, knowing full well that she harbored some sort of resentment towards him and would take the bait. Now she was taking her best shots at him, trying to bring him down and make him pay. He wanted to be angry with her, wanted to hate her for what she had done to him, all for the sake of revenge. But part of him felt he deserved it. He hadn't sold her out, but he had betrayed her and the rest of his kin in a way, and he knew that everyone from the village probably wanted him dead too, and some would probably be happy to do the deal themselves if they ever crossed his path. Fuck. He would probably hand them his blades and let them do it. It was part of the reason he had kept his head down and had spent most of his time in hell. His death wouldn't bring back the dead. It wasn't a big enough price to pay for the things he had done. Living was that price. He had to stay alive, live with his sins, and keep walking the path towards whatever scrap of redemption he could find. He had to finish the job he had started 20 years ago. He needed to end the female who had betrayed him and set in motion the events that had turned his life upside down and destroyed the ones of many of his kin. Harbin growled and clenched his fists. First, he had to escape Archangel's hands and find the snow leopard female. He needed to make her believe that she had placed her trust in the wrong people, even when he knew it would only hurt her. Her striking silver-gold eyes had shown a wealth of pain and guilt when he had tried to make her listen to him, telling her the short version of the real course of events that had taken place that day at the village. He couldn't imagine the pain she would feel when he told her everything that had happened and convinced her that Archangel had lied to her. He was certainly going to feel more like a bastard than ever, that was for sure. He paused mid-stride and stared at the blank white wall opposite him. How the fuck had she softened the hardest parts of him so quickly, pulling down all of his barriers and setting his emotions free? A week ago, he wouldn't have been concerned about hurting her. Fuck, he wouldn't have been concerned about telling her the truth. He would have been focused on killing her as payment for her betraying him. What was it about her that had him going against his darker nature and his training as an assassin? She was a mark, by her own choice, since she had clearly taken out the contract on herself to entrap him. But she was a mark nonetheless. A target, a mission, nothing more than a job. But she had done nothing wrong. She hadn't killed anyone or stolen anything or done anything worthy of him taking her life. The only sin she had committed was the sin of betraying him, born of a need for vengeance that probably burned as fiercely in her heart as the one that blazed in his. And hadn't he really betrayed her in the first place? Hadn't he betrayed all of his kin, with his constant straying from the village to sleep with mortal females, that must have drawn the eyes of Archangel to that town and his pride in the first place? Hadn't he betrayed them when he had used his position within the pride, albeit in a coded manner, to impress the huntress Archangel had sent to squeeze information out of him? He had told her that he was in charge, a male in position of power, because his father was out of town. He had basically given her the green light to attack his pride by revealing they were vulnerable, without their alpha to protect them. Gods. He screwed his eyes shut and dug the heels of his hands into them, his head hurting with the collision happening in it, a twisting and churning relentless stream of thoughts that tore at him. He deserved whatever the female snow leopard had in store for him, and if it would take away some of the pain she held locked inside her, born of her years of captivity in this terrible place, he would willingly subject himself to it. Whatever pain she wanted to deal to him, he would take it. He would do all he could to atone for his sins. But first, he needed to get her away from Archangel. He needed to tell her everything and convince her to allow him to track and put an end to the huntress, who had brought them both so much pain and changed their lives for the worse forever. He touched the 3 jagged marks on his right cheek. He had to save her. He couldn't deny that need. It pounded in his blood, a deep visceral ache that owned him. He couldn't leave her here where she was in danger. He needed to protect her. He wouldn't fail her again. He turned back towards the glass front of his cell. The lights dropped, plunging the entire floor into darkness, and a siren wailed. A moment later, red lights began to flash, giving him glimpses of his surroundings. He covered his ears and grimaced, struggling to focus as the assault continued. Guards rushed past his cell, and the other prisoners grew loud enough for him to hear over the shrieking pulse of the alarm. Something was happening. Harbin cursed. Had the dragon escaped his captors? If he had, the bastard had better be on his way to him to take him up on his offer. His cursing turned into a long growl. There was no way he would be able to convince the dragon to take a detour to search for the snow leopard female. He doubted she would return to the cell where she had been held if she was working with Archangel, and he wasn't sure how big the building was or where to begin looking for her. The need to protect her warred with a need to escape. He had her scent now. He could track her and find her. But the building was swarming with Archangel hunters, and all of them had probably armed themselves the moment the alarm had sounded. He slammed his fist into the glass front of his cell as a sense of futility swept through him. As much as he wanted to save her, he couldn't. The number of hunters he had seen during his captivity was only a small percentage of the total number that occupied this building. Any attempt to find the female would end in him being captured again. It was no use. He had to take the opportunity to escape when it came. He would return for her. He swore that under his breath. He wouldn't allow Archangel to poison her mind any longer. He would set her free. Noise in the corridor drew his attention there. He caught a glimpse of a mortal male dressed in black fatigues and a flash of blue leather-clad legs. The dragon. They were dragging him back to his cell. Damn it. If he had been the cause of the alarm, they would have shut it off the moment he had been rendered unconscious and placed back in containment, which meant someone else was responsible. He tried to focus through the noise, honing his senses, seeking out anything fey or immortal in origin. The sense of power emitted by the dragon interfered with his search, making it hard for him to tell whether someone equally or more powerful had launched an attack on Archangel. He focused harder, determined to understand what was happening. He had a brief sensation of power, strength the magnitude of which he had only felt in hell when fallen angels were near him, and then it was gone. What the hell was going on? He strode to the wall that separated him from the dragon and banged on it. "What's happening?" he hollered and waited, willing Loki to respond. He wasn't sure whether the male was merely drugged or actually unconscious, but he hoped it was the former, because between the irritating siren and the growing hunger to escape, he wasn't sure how long he had before he completely lost his shit. His animal form prowled beneath the surface of his skin, making him itch with a need for freedom and cool night air, a desperate hunger that made the cell seem to shrink around him, until it felt too confined, closing in on him and stealing the air from his lungs. He had to get the fuck out of this hell. He couldn't wait for Hart to come. He couldn't. He had to get away, whether it was with the female in tow or left behind for him to rescue later. Right now, he just needed air and space. Freedom. He pressed his palms to the wall, focusing on the male in the cell beyond, and whispered, "Come on, Loki." The dragon was his shot at escaping during the insanity happening around him. Even dazed by drugs, the shifter male would be strong enough to beat his way out of the cell if he put his mind to it. He had to be. He felt Loki move at last and sensed him coming closer. "I do not know." Loki's deep voice rumbled through the wall and the alarms fell silent. Sweet fucking mercy, Harbin could hear himself think again. The dragon huffed. "I sensed a strong presence near me, and then the infernal lights began flashing, and that noise began. It's called an alarm. They raise it when something bad happens." How little did dragons know about the mortal world? Harbin knew they couldn't be in it, but surely they could keep up to date somehow. He didn't have time to explain everything to Loki, not when the crushing need to escape was growing stronger by the second, and not when each of those seconds that ticked by stole more of the dragon's power. "Then something bad has happened." Loki moved closer still. Now that Loki was nearer to him, Harbin could feel that he was already drastically weaker than when he had first arrived in his cell. Too weak to break the glass and aid Harbin in his escape? That thought had his throat closing, his stomach twisting, and his snow leopard side pushing for freedom, wild with a need to run free. Harbin shoved away from the wall and started pacing again, breathing hard and fast, struggling against his animal form as it rippled over his skin. No good would come from changing. It wouldn't give him the added strength he needed in order to escape the cell. But he couldn't stop the urge that ran rampant through him, stronger than he had ever felt it. He had to shift. He snarled, his canines lengthening and his claws emerging. He couldn't take it anymore. He had thought he was strong enough to survive a few days in Archangel's hands, but he wasn't. Being here, being near the female and discovering what he had done to her, and what Archangel had done to her and others because of him, was too much to bear. His heart couldn't take it, not when the female had softened it, leaving it vulnerable once more. He clawed at his chest, punching holes in his black t-shirt. Fur rippled over his skin, a flash of silver marked with darker spots. The alarm started again, the red flashing light stinging his sensitive eyes and making him growl through his fangs. A shriek pierced the wailing noise, not mechanical but made by a living creature. The scent of blood crept into his cell. Was Archangel under attack? His claws grew longer as more grunts sounded, and the metallic clash of weapons reached his ears. A battle. He itched for freedom for a different reason as the noises grew louder, coming closer to his cell. He wanted to fight too. He wanted to make Archangel pay for everything they had done. He prowled closer to the glass, his breathing turning heavier and harder, his chest heaving as he struggled for control and fought for patience. His time would come. Archangel would pay in blood for the things they had done to him and his kin. They would pay for the things they had done to the female. The need to avenge her burned hot in his blood, and he couldn't contain the feral roar as it rose up his throat, his primal instincts forcing it from his lips as every inch of him coiled tight, ready for the coming battle, itching for it. He would avenge her. "Can you see anything?" He managed to push the words out, more growl than syllables when his animal side was at the helm, and he was barely suppressing the shift, holding himself in mortal form by sheer will alone. "Nothing." Frustration laced that word, speaking of Loki's deep desire to escape, a desire that matched his. The sounds grew closer, the fight near enough that a splash of blood landed on the pristine white tiles outside his cell. Whoever had invaded Archangel this time meant business. He pressed his palms and his cheek to the cool glass front of his cell, desperate to catch a glimpse of the fight and the ones responsible for shedding so much Archangel blood so swiftly. The alarms ceased and the lights stopped flashing, the brighter white ones coming back so suddenly that Harbin flinched. When he opened his eyes again, they widened. Clad in skin-tight obsidian armor, his blue-black hair disheveled by the violent clash, and crimson splattered across his pale skin, and his violet eyes filled with displeasure and irritation, his boss was a formidable sight, but Harbin's heart leaped in his chest all the same. "Heart!" he barked, and the elf slid him a thoroughly unimpressed look as he strode towards him. "What the devil made you toss yourself into this predicament?" Hart stopped outside of Harbin's cell, and he was about to answer when he felt the familiar and unsettling sensation that only one person caused in him. He looked off to his left, to the other elf standing there, glaring into Loki's cell, his jet-black eyes no doubt narrowed on the shifter. Fury curled his lip at Loki, flashing a hint of fang, and then waved his hand in the air, producing a cloth. He methodically wiped his long black blade on it, cleaning the blood from the metal, the look in his eyes relaying the dark thoughts in his mind. He wanted to kill Loki, too, and probably every other poor fae, immortal, or vampire in the cell block. Fury didn't distinguish between friend and foe, because he saw only foes. Tainted bastard. Harbin felt sure that Hart was the only one capable of keeping Fury in line, and that without his boss holding the mad bastard's leash, the elf would have killed Harbin and every assassin at the guild a long time ago. "Fury, get your backside in gear and deal with those guards." Hart pointed towards the end of the corridor they had come from. Fury grinned, sick excitement flashing in his black eyes, as he turned to face his new enemies and crooked his armored clawed finger, beckoning them to their doom. His pointed ears flared back against overlong blue-black hair that he had drawn back to reveal them, securing the top half into a ponytail with an elegant silver clasp, but leaving the rest down to curl around the neck of his obsidian armor. He bared his fangs and disappeared in a flash. Hart watched him go, his carefully schooled expression not hiding the wariness he felt, the regret. Harbin growled, regaining his attention. Hart could be as cold as fury when he needed to be, but the elf still had a little too much heart at times, was swayed by it when he should have been stronger. Archangel deserved what Fury was dishing out to them, and if Harbin were free of his cell, he would be fighting alongside the elf, no trace of regret or pity in his veins. Hart sighed out his breath and slowly slid his violet gaze back to Harbin, and this time the compassion in it was for him. He bared his fangs at his boss, reminding him that he didn't need his pity, and that he had sworn to keep everything Harbin had told him to himself. If Fury caught Hart looking at him as if he was a special snowflake and needed someone to take care of him, it wouldn't be long before the entire guild was talking about him behind his back, trying to figure out why Hart treated him differently from the rest of them. "Stand back." Hart pulled a small black device from the air, twisted it, and pressed it to the glass of Harbin's cell. He flicked a look at Loki. "I suggest you move back too." Harbin did as instructed, striding to the back of his cell and curling into a ball in one corner, covering his head with his arms as he tucked it close to his knees. He sensed Hart move and braced himself. A bright flash, a deafening bang, and then a shock wave rocked him, and 1,000 needles stung his flesh as pieces of the glass hit him. He grunted and grimaced, his ears ringing and the tiny lacerations stinging for a few seconds before his body began to heal them. In the distance, Hart muttered several curses in the mortal tongue. Boots crunched on the fragments of glass. "I suggest you escape this place." Those words weren't directed at him. Hart was speaking to Loki. Harbin had to do something. He couldn't leave the dragon behind. They could all escape together. He pushed onto his feet and carefully crossed the treacherous span of glass-littered tiles to the front of his cell, grimacing whenever a piece cut into his bare soles. "Desist!" The deep, commanding voice had Hart whipping his head in the direction of the end of the corridor, and Harbin's stomach dropped as he sensed the wave of power that washed through the cell block. There would be no escaping that way, not when the newcomer was blocking their path. Whoever he was too powerful for them to fight, and Hart seemed to know it. Even worse, Fury seemed to know it too. The elf was suddenly beside Hart, a stunned expression on his face that quickly morphed back into dark lines that said he was ready to challenge this new foe, even when he wasn't sure he would win the battle. Mad bastard. Harbin reached the front of his cell. "Take the dragon." Hart flicked him a look that made his stomach sink lower. "I cannot teleport 3. I'm sorry." His boss dropped his violet gaze to his boots, a sorrowful edge to his expression, and then drew in a deep breath. Harbin didn't have a chance to argue with him. Hart grabbed him with one hand and collared Fury with the other. He caught a flash of a bare-chested male with bright blue hair standing beyond the cracked glass front of a cell, and then darkness swallowed him whole. Damn it! He shirked Hart's grip the second they landed in an unfamiliar dark city street and paced away from him, the cuts on his feet stinging with each stride across the wet tarmac. Hart's steady gaze followed him, and he could sense the elf's desire to apologize. He shot Hart a look that told him it wasn't necessary, because he knew that if he could have, he would have taken Loki with them. Hart would have seen it as a golden opportunity to add a dragon shifter to their ranks. Hart drew down another deep breath and slowly sank to his haunches. He rested his elbows on his bent knees and stared straight ahead, his violet eyes turning unfocused. Harbin knew better than to ask if he was feeling all right. Teleporting 3 took a lot out of him, when one of the 3 was Fury. As mad as the elf was, he was extremely powerful, and that meant he drained Hart's strength. The rule with teleporting went that the more powerful a being an elf teleported with them, the bigger the drain on their power, and the longer it took them to recover. They would have to wait for Hart to recuperate, and they would have to do it somewhere in the mortal realm. Carrying both him and Fury just a short distance from Archangel would have sucked the strength from Hart. There was no way he could teleport all 3 of them back to hell without killing himself. They needed a place to hide, and Harbin needed answers. And there was one place they might find both of those things. Underworld.